She was worth $3 billion and running for her life through a back alley in Seattle, barefoot, bleeding, and screaming into the rain. He was a man who had buried his instincts so deep he almost didn't hear her. Almost. What happened next would drag a retired Navy SEAL back into the world he'd tried to leave behind and pull a $1 billion CEO into the only place money couldn't reach. A cramped apartment, a little girl's laughter, and a life so ordinary it felt like oxygen after years of drowning. This is the story of two broken people who saved each other in ways neither of them ever saw coming. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens between a SEAL, a billionaire, and a little girl named Sophie is going to stay with you long after the credits roll. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain came in sideways that Thursday night. The kind of Pacific Northwest rain that didn't just fall but drove itself into every gap in your jacket and soaked through to whatever small warmth you'd managed to hold on to. Seth Newman walked with his head slightly down, his left hand holding a canvas grocery bag, his right gripping his daughter's small hand like he was keeping her from floating away. Sophie was 9 years old and incapable of silence for more than 30 consecutive seconds. She was in the middle of explaining, with complete seriousness, why penguins would make better pets than dogs when Seth felt rather than heard something change in the air 2 blocks ahead. It was a shift, a pressure, something that didn't belong to the rain or the wind or the ordinary sounds of Capitol Hill shutting itself down for the night. He didn't say anything to Sophie. He just squeezed her hand once, gently. "Dad," she tugged back. "Are you even listening?" "Penguins?" he said. "Yeah. I said they'd be too cold." "They would." "Dad." He slowed their pace without appearing to. His eyes moved without his head turning, a habit from another life, from briefings in rooms with no windows and missions that didn't have names. He'd spent 5 years trying to kill that habit. Standing at workbenches, repairing electronics, eating dinner at 6 o'clock, reading Sophie's bedtime stories in a voice so deliberately calm it was practically sedative. He'd tried so hard to become the kind of man who didn't notice things like shifts in the air. It never quite took. The sound came from the mouth of the alley between the dry cleaner and the old Vietnamese restaurant on Pike. A woman's voice pitched high and sharp, not a full scream, more like something that started as one and was being pressed shut by panic or a hand or both. Sophie heard it too. Her fingers tightened around his. "Stay here," Seth said. "Dad, right here." He crouched to her level and looked at her directly. Sophie had her mother's eyes, dark and serious and too old for her face in certain light. "You stand right here at this corner and you do not move. You understand me?" She nodded. She didn't argue. She'd seen that look on her father's face exactly twice in her life, and both times she had not argued. Seth set the grocery bag at her feet and moved toward the alley. There were 3 of them. He processed this in under 2 seconds. The geometry of it, who was where, what each man was doing with his weight and his hands. The woman was pressed against the brick wall at the alley's dead end, maybe 30 feet in. One man had his forearm across her collarbone, holding her in place. A second man was rifling through her purse, which he'd torn from her shoulder. The third stood slightly off to the left, watching the mouth of the alley, which meant his head was already turning toward Seth when Seth entered. "Walk away, man," the third one said. He wasn't holding anything visible, but his hand was in his jacket pocket, and his posture had the particular stiffness of someone who wanted Seth to imagine what that meant. Seth looked at the woman. Her lip was split. Her silk blouse was torn at the shoulder. She was trying very hard not to make any sound, which Seth recognized as shock. The body shutting down noise because it didn't have enough bandwidth for both noise and survival. "Let her go," Seth said. He said it the way you'd say close the door or pass the salt. Flat, not aggressive, not afraid. The man with the forearm across the woman's chest said something crude and tightened his grip. The one with her purse laughed. The lookout took a step toward Seth with his hand still in his pocket. Seth was already moving before the step completed. What happened next lasted approximately 11 seconds. Later, when Seth tried to reconstruct it, He couldn't find the individual moments. It had been too fluid, too automatic, like muscle memory that didn't need his brain's permission. A grabbed wrist, redirected forward into a wall. An elbow. A controlled takedown that used a man's momentum against him and left him face down on wet pavement. The lookout's hand finally came out of his pocket. Empty, as it turned out, right before Seth's forearm connected with his jaw at an angle that sat him down hard against a dumpster. The third man, the one who'd been holding the woman, backed up 3 steps and looked at his 2 friends on the ground and looked at Seth. And something in his face made a decision. He ran. The one by the dumpster scrambled up and followed. The one who'd had her purse left it on the ground and went after them. Seth stood in the rain and breathed. The woman slid down the wall until she was crouching, both arms wrapped around herself, her hair plastered to her face. Her purse was sitting in a puddle 3 feet away. One of her heels had snapped off. She was shaking, not with cold, with something bigger than cold. Seth walked over and crouched down to her level. "You're okay," he said. "They're gone." She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and sharp and wet, and something in them, some quality of assessment that didn't quit even in crisis, told him immediately that she was not a woman who was accustomed to needing anyone. "I know," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected, steadier than most people's voices would be 11 seconds after what she'd just been through. "Can you stand up?" She tried. Her ankle gave slightly, the broken heel and probably a twist underneath it, and Seth put his hand under her elbow without asking. She let him. "My daughter's at the corner," he said. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe and call you a cab or an Uber or whatever you need, okay?" She looked at him for a moment. Not scared. Something more like calculating, like she was still deciding how much to trust the situation. "Okay," she said. "That's..." Sophie had not moved from the corner. She was standing with her back against the building and her arms crossed over her chest and her expression carefully neutral, which Seth recognized as her version of trying very hard not to look afraid. When she saw him emerge from the alley with a woman, some of the tension left her face. "Is she hurt?" Sophie asked. "Little bit," Seth said. "My name is Sophie," Sophie told the woman. "What happened to your lip?" "Sophie, I'm just asking." The woman looked down at her with an expression that was hard to read, like she hadn't quite calibrated yet for something this direct and this small. "Someone hit me," she said. "Did my dad stop them?" "He did." Sophie looked at her father with satisfaction. "Okay," she said, and picked up the grocery bag. Seth's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on East Pine that was clean but had given up on being anything more than functional sometime in the early 90s. The elevator worked about 2/3 of the time. The hallway carpeting was a pattern that might have been intentional once. The door to 312 stuck slightly in the frame and required a particular firm push, which Seth did without thinking, and which the woman noticed with an expression he caught out of the corner of his eye. Not judgment, something more like involuntary observation. Inside, Sophie took over. She installed the woman on the couch with the authority of someone twice her age, disappeared into the bathroom, and returned with the first aid kit. A proper one, not a gas station special, which she set on the coffee table and opened with practiced efficiency. "We do this a lot," Sophie explained, pulling out antiseptic. "Dad's always got cuts." "Work injuries," Seth said from the kitchen, where he was filling a glass with water. "He fixes electronics," Sophie told the woman. "But before that he was in the military. He doesn't talk about it, but I know it was the Navy." "Sophie." "What?" "You were." The woman held the glass Seth handed her and watched Sophie clean the cut on her lip with the careful focus of someone who'd done this before and took it seriously. Something around the woman's eyes softened. Not quite relaxation, more like the first small drop in a very high wall. "I'm Zoe," she said. "Seth." He sat in the chair across from her. "You want to tell me what that actually was? Because the way those guys were positioned, that wasn't random." Zoe looked at him over Sophie's head. A long pause, considering. "Not random," she confirmed. "Okay. It's a long story." "Sophie," Seth said, "can you go put the groceries away?" I know what you're doing, Sophie said. I know you do. Go anyway. Sophie sighed with theatrical suffering and went. The moment she was in the kitchen, the ambient temperature of the room changed slightly. The particular shift that happens when an adult conversation is finally allowed to be one. Zoe set the glass down on the coffee table and pressed the back of her hand against her lip for a moment. In the apartment light, with her hair drying and the rain-soaked silk of her blouse pulling tight across her shoulders, Seth could see her more clearly. She was younger than he'd initially clocked, early 30s maybe, wearing a watch that probably cost more than his rent. She was also, despite everything, sitting with her spine straight, her shoulders set, her chin slightly elevated in the unconscious posture of someone who had spent years making sure rooms knew she was in them. He recognized the posture. He'd seen it on commanding officers, on people who'd had to prove something for so long it became structural. "How much trouble are you in?" Seth asked. Zoe looked at her hands. Something in her face shifted. The public architecture of it giving way just briefly to the more complicated thing underneath. "A lot," she said, "depending on what happens in the next 72 hours. "You need police?" "No." The word came fast and flat. "Not yet." "Maybe not at all." Seth waited. She looked up at him, made a decision. "My name is Zoe Lewis," she said. He didn't react. "Meridian Technologies," she added. A beat. He knew the name. Not from following business news, but from the way you know a name when it's big enough to pass through ordinary life by osmosis. The company had built half the data infrastructure in the Pacific Northwest. There'd been something in the news recently, some board dispute, some legal issue. He hadn't paid attention. "Okay," he said. She watched him. "You know who I am?" "I knew the company name. You want to tell me why someone sends 3 men into an alley in Seattle after the CEO of Meridian Technologies?" She was quiet for a moment, long enough that Seth could hear Sophie in the kitchen, taking items out of the grocery bag one at a time and narrating them to herself in a low murmur, the way she did when she thought no one could hear. Then Zoe told him. Os. She was precise about it. No self-pity. She gave him the facts in order and without decoration, and Seth understood immediately why she'd structured it that way. She was a woman who'd spent years in rooms full of people looking for any wobble in her composure to exploit, and the precision was armor. Daniel Crane had been her business partner for 6 years. He'd been there when Meridian was still running out of a shared office space in Belltown, when they were 12 people surviving on bad coffee and terrifying ambition. He was the first person who'd treated Zoe's ideas as things worth funding, and she'd trusted him with everything that entailed. She paused after saying that, just a fraction of a second. Long enough. What she didn't know, what she should have known, she said, and Seth heard the self-recrimination underneath the neutral delivery, was that sometime in the last 2 years, Daniel had started redirecting company funds. Slowly at first. Small amounts routed through shell accounts in ways designed to look like standard operating expenditure. Then bigger amounts. Then, when he realized the scale of what he'd built and that someone would eventually notice, he did something elegant and ruthless. He constructed a paper trail that made it look like Zoe had done it. The fraud charges had come through her company attorney's office 3 weeks ago. 18 hours later, her personal accounts were frozen, pursuant to an emergency court motion she hadn't been notified of until after the fact. Her access to Meridian's internal systems had been revoked by a board she'd assembled herself. The attorney she'd trusted since the company's 2nd year had turned out to have a prior relationship with Daniel that she'd never known about. He had it planned, Seth said. Thoroughly. She said it without inflection, but her jaw tightened slightly. The only thing he didn't account for was that I'd already made copies of the original financial records, before my access was cut. The data that shows what he actually did is on my laptop. Where's your laptop? Hotel room. Different hotel than the one he thinks I'm in. Seth looked at her. And tonight? Tonight I was meeting someone, a financial analyst who agreed to look at the records and testify to what they show. She touched her lip again. I didn't make it to the meeting. He knew where you'd be. She didn't answer, which was its own answer. Seth sat back in his chair and rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, and thought about what kind of person plants three men in a rainy alley to intercept a woman he's already financially and legally eviscerated. The kind of person who isn't satisfied with winning. The kind who needs the other side not just defeated, but unable to get back up. He'd met that type before. In other contexts. In other parts of the world. "You can stay here tonight," Seth said. Zoe looked at him. "I'm not doing it because you're Zoe Lewis or because of Meridian," he said. "I'm doing it because it's raining and your ankle's twisted and I have a pull-out couch and Sophie will be unbearable if I let you leave." Something that was almost a smile moved across Zoe's face. Not quite, but almost. "Thank you," she said. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd clearly been listening through the gap for at least the last 3 minutes, and she was not remotely embarrassed about it. "I put the groceries away," she announced. "Also, we have extra blankets. Also, I think you should stay." She looked at Zoe with the uncompromising directness of a 9-year-old who had decided something. "Do you like grilled cheese? Dad makes it kind of burnt, but it's still pretty good." Seth looked at the ceiling briefly. "A little burnt is fine," Zoe said. "See?" Sophie told her father. "She gets it." Later, after the grilled cheese, which was, in fact, slightly burnt, as advertised, and after Sophie had been put to bed with more argument than was strictly necessary, Seth sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and thought about a woman in a dark alley and how one moment can reach back through 5 years of deliberate quietness and find you. He hadn't fought anyone since he left the teams. He told himself in the first year that he was just taking a break. In the second year, that he was healing. By the third year, when he took the electronics repair job and started volunteering at Sophie's school and built a life that was small and uncomplicated and intentionally dull, he'd started to believe that the man who knew how to clear a room in 11 seconds was someone who used to live in his body. Tonight had disabused him of that. The thing came back too fast and too cleanly to have been truly gone. It had just been waiting, somewhere below the apartment and the grocery runs and the slightly burnt grilled cheese, patient as a stone in deep water. He didn't know how he felt about that. From the living room came the quiet sound of Zoe shifting on the pullout, finding a position in which the thin mattress was survivable. Seth thought about a woman worth $3 billion sleeping on a fold-out couch in a third-floor walk-up in Capitol Hill, with a stuck front door and a grocery bag full of real food, and a 9-year-old's extra blanket tucked around her. He thought about the way she'd said thoroughly when she described what Daniel Crane had done to her. The particular flatness of it. The way a person sounds when they've absorbed something enormous and haven't yet decided where to put it. He got up, rinsed his mug in the sink, and stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway, looking at nothing in particular. Whatever was coming, whatever the next 72 hours looked like for Zoe Lewis and her laptop, and her evidence and her dismantled empire, he had a feeling it wasn't going to stay neatly on her side of the door. He turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment. Outside, the rain had not let up. Seth was up before 6. He hadn't slept much. 2 or 3 hours at the outside, the rest of the night spent in the particular alertness that had returned to him without asking permission, the kind where his body stayed still, but his mind ran quiet perimeter checks on every sound the building made. The elevator cable settling. A neighbor's door closing somewhere above. Rain still working at the windows, lighter now, more like suggestion than assault. He made coffee in the dark and stood at the kitchen window and watched Capitol Hill come apart from the night in pieces. The first headlights, the first illuminated windows across the street, a man walking a dog below in a yellow slicker, moving fast like he had somewhere better to be. When he finally heard movement from the living room, he poured a second mug and left it on the counter and didn't say anything. Zoe appeared in the kitchen doorway looking like a woman who had slept badly on a pull-out couch, which is to say exactly like that. Hair compressed on one side, a small crease running diagonally across her cheek from the pillow, the borrowed t-shirt she'd slept in slightly twisted at the hem. She was holding herself together by posture alone, spine straight out of what was clearly pure habit, and she looked at the mug on the counter and then at Seth. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was rougher in the morning, less constructed. Seth leaned against the counter with his own mug. "How's the ankle?" "Manageable." She picked up the coffee and held it in both hands and stared at it for a moment. I need to make some calls. Eat something first. She looked like she was going to argue and then looked at the coffee and apparently decided that one battle at a time was enough. Seth opened the refrigerator, found eggs, found the half block of cheddar Sophie hadn't finished, found 2 slices of bread that were still viable. I don't actually need. I know you don't need it, Seth said. I'm making it anyway. Zoe was quiet. She sat down at the kitchen table, not in the chair nearest the door, which was something Seth noticed and cataloged without knowing exactly why, and wrapped both hands around the mug and watched him crack eggs into the pan. You cook, she said, like it was mildly surprising. Not well. Sophie tolerates it. She seems like she tolerates most things. She doesn't, actually. He kept his eyes on the pan. She has opinions about everything, and she'll tell you all of them. You just didn't get the full experience last night. Something that was more than almost a smile crossed Zoe's face that time. The eggs weren't spectacular, but they were hot, and Seth put them on a plate with the toast, slightly less burnt than the grilled cheese, and set it in front of her without ceremony. She ate like someone who'd forgotten they were hungry until the food was in front of them. That particular unconscious focus, fork moving before the conscious mind had fully committed to the meal. They were mostly quiet. It was an unexpectedly comfortable quiet, which Seth found mildly unsettling because he had known this woman for approximately 8 hours. Sophie came out of her bedroom at 7:15 in her pajamas and socks and stopped in the kitchen doorway and assessed the situation with the thoroughness of a building inspector. You're still here, she told Zoe. I am, Zoe said. Good. Sophie climbed into the chair next to her like it was entirely normal and looked at the remaining piece of toast on Zoe's plate. Are you going to eat that? Sophie, Seth said. I'm just asking. Zoe pushed the plate toward her. Sophie took the toast and ate it, and then looked at Zoe with the direct, slightly disconcerting attention she reserved for things she found genuinely interesting. What kind of company do you run? She asked. Zoe looked at Seth. He shrugged slightly, meaning, I have never found a good way to divert her when she's decided to know something. Technology, Zoe said. Infrastructure, the systems that help other companies store and move data. Sophie considered this. Is it like fixing computers but bigger? That's actually not a bad way to put it. My dad fixes computers and phones and wants a really old stereo. Sophie took another bite of toast. He said the stereo was the best one. The wiring was interesting, Seth said, in a tone that discouraged elaboration. Sophie looked between them and seemed to file something away. Seth recognized that look, had been seeing it since she was about 6, and started noticing when adults were doing things they weren't saying out loud. It didn't worry him exactly. It was just Sophie being Sophie. But he made a mental note. After breakfast, after Sophie retreated to her room to get dressed with loud complaints about it being a school day, the kitchen shrank back to 2 adults and a problem that had been patient all morning. Zoe put her mug down. I need to get back to my hotel, she said. The laptop can't be there alone much longer. If Daniel's people found where I was last night, they may already know where I'm staying. Which hotel? She hesitated, just a fraction. I'm not going to tell Daniel Crane, Seth said flatly. She looked at him, then, the Lakeview Inn on Eastlake. I checked in under a different name. How long ago? 6 days ago. And nobody's moved on it yet. Not as of last night, but... She stopped, rearranged something in her expression. The man I was going to meet. The financial analyst. His name is Marcus Webb. He works at an independent audit firm downtown. He agreed to review the records on the condition that I come to him, because he didn't want documentation of him coming to me. If those men intercepted me because someone told them where I'd be, then either Marcus talked to someone or I'm being tracked through something I'm carrying. She paused. Or both. Seth thought about that. Your phone. I've had it off since last night. I know that's the obvious one. You have another one? A prepaid. I bought it 3 weeks ago when this started. She looked at her hands for a moment. Flat, level look. The kind people do when they're making themselves look at something they'd rather not. I made one call from my regular phone 2 days ago, to my sister in Portland. I shouldn't have, but I needed to hear her voice. I kept it under a minute. Seth set his own mug down. He didn't say anything about the call because there was nothing useful to say about it, and she already knew it had been a risk and had made it anyway, and he understood that kind of decision without needing to discuss it. "Write down the hotel address," he said. "I'll go get the laptop." She stared at him. "You can't just... You've got a twisted ankle and your face has a split lip, and whoever Daniel sent last night may still be covering the area around wherever you were going. Me walking to the Lakeview Inn is a lot less visible than you doing it." He picked up his mug and carried it to the sink. "Is the room key biometric or physical card?" "Physical card, but write down the room number and the name you used to check in. I'll figure out the key situation with the front desk." Zoe looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and the very particular friction of a person who was used to solving their own problems, having to accept that they couldn't solve this one alone. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Seth ran water in the sink, rinsed the mugs. "Because right now you need help, and I'm the one here." "That's not a sufficient answer." "It's the only one I've got." He turned off the tap and turned around. "Write down the room number." He made arrangements with the school for Sophie, an early drop-off with her teacher, who knew Sophie well enough to know she'd be fine, and walked to the Lakeview Inn in 35 minutes through rain that had thinned to mist. The hotel was a mid-tier place, the kind that exists in every city in a particular strip between budget and boutique, clean enough and anonymous enough and staffed by people who'd seen enough check-ins under unusual circumstances to handle one more without excessive curiosity. Seth explained at the front desk that his wife had been in an accident, which was not untrue in the broadest structural sense, he thought, and that a woman had been injured in an alley, and that he needed to collect her belongings. He had the room number, the check-in name, a description of the guest that was accurate, and a manner that did not invite follow-up questions. The front desk gave him a replacement key card. Room 214 was on the second floor facing the alley side, not the street. Deliberate choice, Seth recognized. Harder to be seen from outside. Inside, the room was neat with the neatness of someone who had packed carefully and lived carefully in a space they knew was temporary. 2 changes of clothes folded over the desk chair. A toiletry bag on the bathroom counter, zipped. A takeout container in the trash, the only sign of disorder. And on the desk, a laptop. A good one, thin and black, surrounded by a small stack of papers that had been folded and refolded along the same creases multiple times, the way documents get when you've opened and closed them enough that the paper starts to soften at the seams. Seth took the laptop, the papers, the toiletry bag, and the folded clothes, packing them into the small rolling bag he found under the bed. He moved quickly but not fast enough to suggest urgency to anyone watching. At the desk, he checked a particular drawer just to check, and found a prepaid phone and a hotel pen and a notepad. He took the phone. He was back on the street in under 4 minutes. He didn't take the direct route home. Zoe was standing in the living room when Seth got back, still in the borrowed t-shirt, her regular clothes, silk blouse, destroyed slacks, laid over the back of the couch in a way that suggested she'd been staring at them and thinking about what they represented. She turned when he came in and her eyes went straight to the rolling bag, and something in her face did a complicated thing. Relief. And underneath it, something raw. Something that might have been the first solid ground she'd felt under her feet in a while. "Everything was there," Seth said. "Nobody had been in the room." She let out a breath. "Okay. You should change hotels. Today, if possible." "I know." She sat down on the couch. "I know." She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment, which was the first time Seth had seen her make a gesture that looked anything other than controlled. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then she straightened up and reached for the bag. He sat in the chair across from her and gave her a minute to go through the contents and satisfy herself that everything was intact. She checked the laptop first, opened it, confirmed something on screen with the focused look of someone reading a number, closed it again. Then she went through the folded papers, checking each one briefly. "It's all here," she said. "Good." Seth rested his elbows on his knees. "Now tell me the rest of it." She looked up. "I told you most of it last night." "You told me the structure, the how. I want to know the why." He paused. "What does Daniel actually want? The company? The money?" Just to get clear of his own crimes? Zoe looked at the papers in her hands. A long pause. Outside, a car went by on Pike, tires hissing on wet asphalt. All three, she said, but mostly the company. She set the papers down on the coffee table with care. Meridian has a government contract renewal coming up in 4 months. $2.4 billion, 5-year term. The kind of deal that defines what the company becomes for the next decade. Daniel knows that if I'm in prison or even just buried in fraud litigation, I won't be there to renegotiate it. He takes over operational control, rides the contract through, and by the time anyone figures out what he actually did, he's got enough cash and enough distance that it doesn't matter. She said this cleanly, without drama. He planned it well. I have to give him that. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Her jaw worked slightly. The most humiliating part of this isn't what he did to the company or to my reputation. It's that I trusted him. 6 years. I thought I knew him. Seth looked at her. People are good at being two things at once. She met his eyes. Something in her expression shifted, not toward softness exactly, but toward a kind of recognition, like he'd said something that matched a frequency she'd been operating on alone. Were you? She asked. He hadn't expected that. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said, for a long time. She didn't ask him to explain it. He didn't. The conversation that followed was different from the night before, less structured, less purposeful, moving around the edges of things rather than into them. Seth made more coffee. Zoe pulled her legs up under her on the couch in a way that had nothing to do with the billionaire CEO and everything to do with a person who was exhausted and had run out of performance. She talked about the financial analyst, Marcus Webb, and what his testimony would actually mean, and whether it would be enough without corroboration from someone inside Meridian's finance department. Seth listened and occasionally asked questions, and the questions were specific and practical, the kind that came from a brain trained to identify structural weaknesses rather than perform concern. You're not just a repairman, Zoe said, at some point, watching him. I am now. That's a choice, not a description. He looked at her. There's a difference? She held his gaze. Yes. He didn't answer that, and she didn't push it, but it sat in the room between them like a third presence. She asked him about the military. He gave her the short version. The Navy, the teams, 12 years, deployment cycles that started blurring together somewhere around year 8. He left out the specific mission that ended it. He didn't have a clean narrative for that one yet, and maybe never would. And Zoe seemed to understand that a stopped sentence had a reason for stopping. Sophie's mother? She asked carefully. Car accident 4 years ago. He said it the way he always said it, straight, without inflection, not because it didn't matter, but because he'd learned that the inflection invited responses he didn't have energy for. Sophie was 5. Zoe was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. Yeah, she's remarkable, Sophie. Seth looked at the hallway toward his daughter's room. She is. A pause. She's better than me in most ways that count. I try not to let her know that because she's already got too many opinions about her own competence. Zoe laughed. A real one, short and a little surprised, like it caught her off guard. It changed her face entirely, made her look younger and less constructed and more like the person she probably was before whatever building process had installed the architecture. What about you? Seth asked. What about me what? You said you lost yourself building the company. How far back do you have to go to find the before? She looked at him steadily, then at the window where the mist had settled into light fog, and the morning was doing its best. I grew up in Cleveland, she said. My parents ran a dry cleaning business. My dad worked 65 hours a week until I was 12, when they finally got to a point where they only needed 50. I watched that and I thought, I'm going to work harder than anyone, and I'm going to make sure I get far enough that the hours become my choice, not a requirement. She paused. I worked harder than anyone. I got far enough. A small, dry sound that was close to a laugh. The hours never became my choice. When did you last take a vacation? She started to answer and then stopped. That long, Seth said. I took a weekend in Cannon Beach in 2022. A weekend. A long weekend. 3 days. 4. She looked at him with something like wry acknowledgement. It was 4 days. I checked my email on all of them. Seth shook his head slowly, not in judgment, but in the particular recognition of someone who understood what it looked like when a person used work as a place to live instead of a thing they did. "What do you actually want?" he asked. "Not for the company, for you. If you clear your name and get out the other side of this, what does that look like?" Zoe was quiet for so long, Seth thought she wasn't going to answer. "I don't know," she finally said. "I used to know. I had a whole list. I'd get to a certain revenue milestone, and then I'd take a real vacation. I'd get past a certain head count, and then I'd start delegating more. I'd get the government contract secured, and then—" She stopped. "And then there was always an and then." She looked at her hands. "I haven't thought about what I want in so long that I'm genuinely not sure the want muscle still works." Seth thought about the first year after he left the teams. The particular vacancy of a life that had been reduced to essential functions: eating, sleeping, taking Sophie to school, and picking her up, repairing things for 8 hours because it was work that had a clear end state. Done. Not done. Fixed. He thought about how long it had taken him to realize that surviving something and living past it were two different skills. "It works," he said. "It just needs time." She looked at him. He looked back. The particular thing that happens sometimes between two people who have been through different versions of the same fundamental destruction and recognize it in each other. Sophie appeared in the hallway at that moment, dressed, backpack on, hair in a ponytail that had been attempted and partially achieved, and looked at both of them with the expression of a 9-year-old who had just processed something without being told what it was. "I'm ready," she announced. "Good," Seth said, standing. "Is Zoe going to be here when I get back?" Seth looked at Zoe. Zoe looked at him. She started. "You shouldn't go to another hotel," Seth said. "Not yet. Not until we know whether the room on Eastlake was watched." It was true. And it was also more than true, and they both understood that, and Seth didn't examine that any further. Zoe looked at Sophie, who was watching her with those serious, steady eyes that were too old for her face. "For a few more hours," Zoe said. Sophie nodded like this was an administrative confirmation of something she'd already decided. "Okay, don't let Dad's coffee get cold on the counter. He does that and then he drinks it cold and makes a face." "I do not." "You do," Sophie said, and walked toward the front door. A few hours became the whole day. Not because of any dramatic turn. There was no second wave of Daniel's people, no emergency call from the financial analyst, no sudden escalation. It became the whole day because Zoe opened her laptop on the kitchen table to go through her documents, and Seth sat across from her doing paperwork from the repair shop. And at noon, Sophie came home from school and made herself a sandwich without being asked, and then sat next to Zoe and wanted to know what she was working on. "Financial records," Zoe said. "What's wrong with them?" "Someone changed them to make them look different from what they are." Sophie chewed her sandwich, considering. "Like lying." "Exactly like lying, but in numbers." "Numbers can lie?" "Numbers can be arranged to say almost anything," Zoe said, "which is why you need to know what they're supposed to say before someone rearranges them." Sophie thought about this with the focused seriousness she brought to things that actually interested her. "That's kind of scary." "It is," Zoe agreed. "Is my dad helping you?" "He went and got my stuff this morning." Sophie looked at her father across the table, who was not looking up from his paperwork. "He doesn't do that for everyone," she said, with the solemnity of someone conveying important insider information. "He's actually pretty suspicious of people normally." "Sophie, I'm just being honest." "I appreciate the information," Zoe told her. Sophie looked satisfied. She finished her sandwich and then, with a casualness that fooled no one, moved her chair slightly closer to Zoe and watched the screen. It was not the afternoon that any of them had planned or expected or would have been able to describe in advance. But Seth, glancing up at some point in the middle of it, at his daughter's head bent next to Zoe's while Zoe pointed at something on the screen and explained it, at the coffee going cold again, and Zoe this time being the one who picked it up and drank it without noticing it was cold, had the unsettling experience of something in his chest, doing something it hadn't done in a long time. He looked back at his paperwork and did not examine that either. It was early evening, and Sophie was setting the table with the proprietary authority she brought to all domestic tasks, and Zoe was in the kitchen doing something with pasta. She'd volunteered, and Seth had accepted with the understanding that it was probably going to be either better or worse than anything he'd make, and either outcome was interesting, when Seth's phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. He picked up. "Mr. Newman?" The voice was smooth and professionally calibrated. "My name is Graham Pierce. I'm an attorney representing Daniel Crane and the board of Meridian Technologies. I'm calling about a matter involving a Ms. Zoe Lewis, with whom I understand you may be acquainted." Seth was quiet for exactly long enough to let Pierce understand that the smoothness of his introduction had not achieved the effect intended. "We're aware that Ms. Lewis may be in your company," Pierce continued. "I want to assure you that Mr. Crane has no interest in complicating your life in any way. He simply needs Miss Lewis to return the company property she took when she vacated." "Company property," Seth said. "Documents and data belonging to Meridian Technologies, yes. The return would allow this situation to be resolved without further—" "She doesn't have company property," Seth said. "She has her own records, which is a different thing." A brief pause. Pierce recalibrated. "Mr. Newman, I want to be very straightforward with you. You have a daughter, you have a job, you have a quiet life that, as far as I can tell, involves nothing that should require the attention of a legal team or anyone else. The situation between Ms. Lewis and Meridian is a corporate matter. There's absolutely no reason it should touch you." Seth looked at the kitchen doorway where he could see Zoe at the stove, her back to him, one hand moving a wooden spoon in a slow circle. "You're right," Seth said. "There isn't. So you understand why—" "I understand why a man who's committed fraud would like the evidence to disappear," Seth said. "I don't understand why you're calling me to help with that, or why you think I would." The smoothness in Pierce's voice thinned slightly. "Not much, but enough." "That's a significant accusation." "Good night, Mr. Pierce," Seth said, and hung up. He stood in the hallway for a moment, phone in hand. From the kitchen came the sound of the pasta water beginning to roll, and Zoe's voice, low and unhurried, telling Sophie something about how you test pasta when you don't have a timer you trust. Sophie was answering with suggestions that were probably wrong but enthusiastic. Something fell, a spoon or a lid, and both of them said sorry at the same time and then laughed about it. Seth pocketed his phone. He walked back to the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at the two of them at the stove in his small, functional, slightly cramped kitchen with the light overhead that had one bulb slightly dimmer than the other. And he thought about what Pierce's call meant, which was that Daniel Crane now knew where Zoe was, and that the quiet window of this day was closing, and that whatever came next was going to be harder and louder and more complicated than a mild-mannered attorney calling a number he wasn't supposed to have. He also thought about the fact that he wasn't afraid of that. He'd spent 5 years trying to want nothing complicated, trying to want only what was manageable and contained and safe. And he understood, standing in that doorway, listening to his daughter explain to a billionaire CEO that pasta was ready when it floated, which was wrong. Pasta doesn't float, but Zoe didn't correct her. He understood that he'd built himself a very small, very careful life, and it had been necessary and he'd needed it. But somewhere along the way, he'd confused necessary with permanent. "Seth." Zoe turned from the stove without quite looking at him. "Who called?" "Someone who works for Daniel Crane," he said. The wooden spoon went still. Sophie looked at her father, reading his face. "He knows I'm here," Zoe said. It wasn't a question. "He knows." She set the spoon down on the counter, turned to face him. Her eyes were sharp and clear, and there was no panic in them, just the focused steadiness of someone who had known a reckoning was coming, and was deciding right now whether to face it standing or not. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Seth said. Sophie looked between them one more time, then looked at the pasta. "It's almost ready," she said, with the particular practicality of a 9-year-old who had decided that dinner was going to happen regardless of what the adults were dealing with, because dinner was dinner. "So whatever you're going to figure out, you should figure it out fast." The pasta was good. That was the strange thing about that evening. The pasta was actually good, and they ate it, all three of them, at the small kitchen table with the slightly uneven leg that Seth had shimmied with a folded matchbook 2 years ago and never properly fixed. And for 40 minutes, the conversation was about Sophie's school project on the water cycle and whether clouds were technically a form of precipitation, which they were not, and whether seahorses were technically fish, which they were. And Zoe answered both questions with a directness that Sophie found satisfying and Seth found quietly impressive. Then Sophie went to bed, and the apartment settled into its nighttime register, and Seth and Zoe sat at the kitchen table with the remains of dinner between them and the weight of Graham Pierce's phone call filling the room like weather. "He'll send someone tomorrow," Zoe said. "Probably tonight." She looked up. "Pierce called to see whether I'd fold," Seth said. "When I didn't, he reported back. Whoever Daniel sends next won't be asking questions." He paused. "We need to move you." "Where?" "Not another hotel. They'll find a hotel." He turned his coffee mug in his hands, a habit he knew, something he did when he was working through geometry. "I have a friend, Ray Castillo, former SEAL, got out before me, runs a security consulting firm in Bellevue now. He's got a place he uses as a safe house for client work. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and off the books, and the address isn't connected to either of us." Zoe was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to keep pulling people into this. Ray's already in things like this. It's his job." Seth looked at her. "And you're past the point where staying still is safer than moving." She knew that. He could see she knew it. But knowing something and accepting the help it required were different actions, and for Zoe Lewis they were separated by a wall that had been built over a long time. "Okay," she said, "but before I go anywhere, I need to contact my attorney. My actual attorney, not the one Daniel had in his pocket. Her name is Carol Finch. She's been practicing corporate law in Seattle for 20 years, and she's the one person I'm certain Daniel hasn't reached." "You're certain?" "I'm certain." No hesitation. "Carol is the reason I got the government contract in the first place. She has no relationship with Daniel. She never liked him, actually. Said once that he smiled too often for someone who didn't mean it." Something crossed Zoe's face, the expression of someone filing away a piece of information that arrived too late to be useful. "I should have listened to that." "Call her in the morning," Seth said. "On the prepaid. Keep it under 3 minutes." Zoe nodded. Then, "Seth?" He looked at her. "The men tonight. If Pierce reports back and Daniel decides to send someone more serious than 3 guys in an alley..." She stopped, restarted. "You have Sophie here." The sentence sat between them and did what it was meant to do. "I know," Seth said. "I'm not trying to..." "I know what you're doing," he said. "You're giving me an exit." He held her gaze. "I don't want an exit." Zoe looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression. Complicated, layered, the kind of thing a person's face does when they're receiving something they didn't expect and aren't sure they know how to hold. "Why not?" she asked. Seth thought about that. Thought about what the honest answer was, as opposed to the clean one. "Because about 14 hours ago I walked into an alley because it was the right thing to do," he said. "I don't stop doing things because they get complicated." She didn't answer that. But she didn't look away either. Seth got up and started clearing the dinner plates, and Zoe helped him, and they did the dishes in the kind of silence that has weight and texture and means something different from ordinary quiet. Ray Castillo picked up on the second ring at 11:15 at night, which told Seth everything he needed to know about how much Ray had changed since getting out, which was not much. "Newman." Ray's voice was the same as it had always been, flat, dry, faintly amused in a way that never quite surfaced into actual amusement. "It's late. I need the East Side place, 2, maybe 3 nights." A pause. Not a surprise pause. Ray didn't do surprised. More a pause of quick, quiet calculation. "For you?" "For someone I'm helping." "Someone." "Woman." "Corporate situation. People are coming for her." "What kind of people?" "The kind that have lawyers make phone calls first and send guys after." Another pause. Shorter. "How many guys, you think?" "Tonight, 2, 3. But the guy behind it has money and a reason to keep escalating. Seth glanced toward the living room where Zoe had disappeared to check her laptop. He's covering a federal-level fraud, and she has the evidence. Ray made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. You've been out 5 years, and you're already doing this. Ray? Place is available. You know the address. Keys under the Gray River stone by the back gate. Same as always. A pause. You need backup? Not yet. Newman. Not yet, Seth said again. But I'll call. See that you do. Ray hung up. They left at 6 the next morning. Seth woke Sophie at 5:30 and told her they were going somewhere for a few days, which Sophie processed with the adaptability of a child who had learned somewhere along the way that her father sometimes had reasons he'd explain later, and that later always came. She packed her own bag with focused efficiency, clothes, her battered paperback copy of a novel she was in the middle of, her colored pencils, her small stuffed rabbit that she still traveled with and would have argued about if Seth had brought it up, which he didn't, and was ready in 18 minutes, which was actually 4 minutes faster than Seth. Zoe had been awake already. She'd barely slept. Seth had heard her moving around at 2, at 3:30, the particular restlessness of a mind that wouldn't grant the body its necessary hours. She had her rolling bag repacked and the laptop in its case, and the folded documents in the inside pocket of a jacket Seth had lent her because it was warm and anonymous and not the kind of thing a billionaire CEO would wear, which was exactly the point. In the early gray of a Seattle morning that couldn't decide between fog and drizzle, Seth put Sophie and Zoe in his truck, an 8-year-old Ford F-150 that started reliably and was the color of a Seattle winter sky, and drove east across the bridge with the radio off and the heater on and nobody talking. Sophie fell back asleep against the window within 6 minutes, her breath fogging the glass in small clouds. Seth drove. Zoe sat in the passenger seat with the laptop case on her lap and her hands folded over it and her eyes on the city moving past in the gray light. I haven't been in a car this old in about 10 years, she said quietly, so as not to wake Sophie. She runs fine. I know, I can tell. A pause. There's something almost aggressive about not caring what you drive. Seth glanced at her sideways. It's a truck. A very intentional truck. It has 4 wheels and an engine. That's exactly what I mean. But she said it with something like warmth underneath it, the mild provocation of someone who had decided they were comfortable enough to be slightly annoying, which was its own kind of thing. The safe house was a small 2-bedroom in a quiet residential block in Bellevue. Nothing that called attention to itself. A house that looked like every third house on the street, with a yard that was maintained to the level of not being notable. Inside it was clean and spare. Functional furniture, a kitchen with the basics, a second bedroom with 2 twin beds. The kind of place designed to house people who needed to exist temporarily without existing publicly. Seth found the key under the river stone and let them in. Sophie woke up fully when the truck stopped and walked into the house with her bag over one shoulder, assessed it in about 15 seconds, and claimed the bedroom with the window overlooking the backyard without consultation. This is mine, she announced. There are 2 beds in there, Seth said. I know. He looked at Zoe. Zoe looked at him. Sophie had apparently already decided the rooming arrangement and was not taking questions. Zoe called Carol Finch at 8:14 from the prepaid phone, standing in the backyard in the flat morning light, with the phone pressed hard to her ear and her free hand shoved in the pocket of Seth's borrowed jacket. Seth watched through the kitchen window without appearing to, the way he did things that required attention without surveillance. The call lasted 4 minutes, slightly over the limit he'd suggested, but he let it go. When Zoe came back inside, her face was different. Something in it had been restored just slightly, like a structural element that had been missing and was now provisionally back in place. Carol's been trying to reach me for a week, Zoe said. She knew something was wrong with the legal filings. She's been doing her own investigation. What did she find? Zoe sat down at the kitchen table. The court motion that froze my accounts, the one that came through without proper notification, Carol thinks it was filed with falsified procedural documentation. A judge signed it, but the supporting affidavit has signatures that she believes were forged. If she's right, the freeze is invalid. Potentially, enough to challenge it. Zoe pressed both hands flat on the table. She's also in contact with a forensic accountant, someone she uses regularly, someone she trusts, not Marcus Webb, someone Daniel doesn't know. Good. She wants me to come in, to her office, today. Seth was quiet for a moment. That's a fixed location? On the record. I know. Zoe looked at him. But Carol said something else. She said the board of Meridian Technologies has been getting pressure from two of its largest institutional investors about the management situation. The fraud allegation against me has spooked them, but apparently Daniel's handling of the interim period has spooked them more. She thinks at least 3 board members are looking for a reason to distance themselves from him. Seth looked at her steadily. The board is about to offer you a deal. Zoe blinked. Carol didn't say, that's what it sounds like. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. 3 board members looking for distance from Daniel, investors nervous. A government contract renewal coming up that requires stability and credibility. You're the founder. Your name is on the building, figuratively speaking. He paused. They're going to ask you to come back. Zoe was quiet. And you need to decide, Seth said, before that offer arrives, what you actually want. Because if you don't know before they ask, they'll make the decision for you. She looked at him across the table. Outside, through the window, the backyard sat still in the thin light. A bird was doing something in the birch tree at the fence line, just moving around in the branches, ordinary and unhurried. I built that company, she said. 12 years. I was 23 when Daniel and I started it. I didn't know anything, and I worked until I knew everything, and I gave it every... She stopped. Something in her face tightened and then deliberately released. I gave it everything I had. For 12 years. I know. It should be mine. It should, Seth agreed. She looked at him, slightly thrown by the agreement. But wanting something back and needing something back are different things, he said, and only one of them is a good reason to go back. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Sophie came out of the bedroom and drifted through the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, looked between the 2 adults with the observational precision of someone who had been reading rooms since before she could read, and drifted back out without saying anything, which, for Sophie, was a significant act of restraint that Seth noted and appreciated. I'll go to Carol's office, Zoe said. This afternoon, we can go through the documents together, get the forensic accountant started on the financial records. She looked at her hands. And if the board calls, I'll listen. That's all I'm committing to. I'll listen. Seth nodded. I'll drive you. You don't have... I'll drive you, he said again. Flat, simple, the same tone as I'm making eggs or write down the room number. The tone that was not asking. Zoe looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression did something quiet and private that she probably didn't intend him to see. Okay, she said, dumb. Carol Finch's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Seattle that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air, and Carol herself was 62 years old, small, sharp-featured, with close-cropped white hair and the manner of someone who had spent 4 decades being underestimated in courtrooms and had learned to find it useful. She came out to the lobby when Seth and Zoe arrived and looked at Seth with the frank, assessing gaze of a woman who did not miss things. You must be the one who found her, Carol said. Depends on how you mean that, Seth said. Carol looked at him for another second, then nodded once, satisfied apparently with something she'd confirmed, and led them back to her office. Seth stayed in the lobby with a copy of a news magazine he didn't read, and Zoe went in and the door closed. He sat for 2 hours. He didn't mind. He'd done more 2-hour waits in less comfortable chairs under worse circumstances. He thought about the geometry of what was unfolding, where the pressure points were, where Daniel Crane's next move would have to come from now that the lawyers and threats approach had failed to move Zoe out of Seattle or into compliance. A man like Daniel, Seth had decided, operated through intermediaries by preference, which meant there was a moment of exposure coming, a moment when Daniel would have to act more directly or watch his carefully constructed position collapse under its own weight. Those moments were the dangerous ones, also the revealing ones. His phone buzzed, the same unknown number as last night. He let it go to voicemail. 20 minutes later, a different number called. He let that go too. When Zoe came out 2 hours later, her posture had changed. Subtly, but Seth read it. Her shoulders were slightly lower, not in defeat, but in the release of weight that had been held too high for too long. She'd been carrying the evidence alone for weeks. Now someone else was carrying part of it. "She's filing to challenge the account freeze tomorrow morning," Zoe said in the elevator down. "The forensic accountant is starting on the financial records tonight. She's also drafting a formal complaint to the state attorney general's office about the procedural irregularities in the original filing. That's aggressive. Carol doesn't do anything else." A pause. The elevator numbers descending. "She also confirmed what you said. 2 board members called her office, not to talk to her, but to find out if she was still representing me." "They're positioning," Seth said. "They want to know whether you're still a viable option before they commit to anything publicly." Which means they haven't committed to Daniel either. "Not fully." The elevator reached the lobby. "Which gives you a window, not a wide one." They walked through the lobby and out onto 2nd Avenue, where the afternoon had turned genuinely cold, the kind of cold that Seattle occasionally remembered it was capable of, and the wind off the sound came through the street gaps with purpose. Zoe stopped on the sidewalk and stood still for a moment, face turned slightly up and into the wind, her eyes closed. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. Seth stood beside her and didn't say anything. "I keep thinking about what it would feel like to walk back in there," she said, eyes still closed. "Into the Meridian building, into the boardroom." She opened her eyes. "I've thought about it for 3 weeks, dreamed about it. The moment of clearing my name, getting my position back." She paused. "And now that it's starting to look possible, I feel—" She stopped. "What?" Seth said. She looked at him, honest and direct and not trying to make it sound better than it was. "I feel tired. Just tired of that place. Tired of what I became in those rooms." She paused again. "Is that a betrayal? Of everything I built?" Seth looked at the street, at the ordinary afternoon motion of a city going about itself. A delivery truck double-parked, 2 women with coffee cups talking outside a pharmacy, a kid on a bicycle cutting between the slow cars. "I left the military," he said. "I'd given it 12 years too. And when I walked away, the first thing I felt, before anything else, was tired. Not of the service, of the version of myself I had to be inside it." He paused. "It wasn't a betrayal. It was information." She looked at him steadily. "The tired is telling you something," he said. "The question is whether you're going to listen to it." She was quiet for a long moment on the sidewalk, with the cold wind and the ordinary city moving around them. Then her phone, the prepaid, buzzed. She looked at the screen, looked at Seth. "It's a number I don't recognize," she said. "Could be Carol with a different line." She answered. "Hello?" A pause. Zoe's face went very still. "This is Richard Baum," said the voice, audible to Seth from where he was standing. "I'm the chairman of Meridian Technologies Board. Miss Lewis, I'd like to speak with you. In person. Today, if possible." Seth drove. Zoe sat in the passenger seat with the phone in her lap and stared at the road ahead, while Seth took them back to Bellevue. "You don't have to meet with him," Seth said. "I know. You can ask Carol to handle initial contact. Keep yourself at a distance until you know what the board actually wants." "Baum was one of my original investors," Zoe said. "He put in the first $4 million when we were 2 years old and nobody else would. He didn't have to do that." She paused. "I don't think he knew what Daniel was doing." "Maybe not, but what he wants now might not align with what you need." Zoe looked at the passing road. "You think I shouldn't meet him?" "I think you should know exactly what you want before you do," Seth said. "Because men like Baum are good at making what they want sound like what you want, and right now you're just starting to figure out the difference between the two." She didn't answer immediately. The city moved past the truck windows, the bridge, the water below it, gray and flat and enormous. "He wants me to come back," she said. "That's what the call is. He wouldn't call himself without a lawyer on the line if it wasn't substantial." "Probably. And I should want that." She turned her head and looked at Seth directly. "Right? Everything I worked for. Everything they took from me. This is the part where I'm supposed to want it back. Seth kept his eyes on the road. What do you want? I don't know. A pause. I genuinely don't know, and that scares me more than Daniel does. The honest answer. Seth heard it for what it was. That's okay, he said. It doesn't feel okay. Most true things don't. He changed lanes, moved the truck through the mid-afternoon traffic with the ease of someone who drove without thinking about it. You don't have to decide today. Call Baum back. Tell him you'll meet in 3 days. That gives Carol time to formally establish your legal position, gives the forensic accountant time to build the evidentiary case, and gives you time to get clear in your own head about what you're actually fighting for. Zoe looked at him for a long moment. You're good at this? At driving? At seeing through the middle of a problem to the actual structure of it. It's geometry, Seth said. Everything is geometry. That's either very profound or very reductive. Probably both. She almost smiled. Then, 3 days is tight. If Daniel knows I've been to Carol's office, and he will know because he has eyes everywhere in that building and that legal community, he'll accelerate. Let him accelerate, Seth said. Accelerating burns fuel. People who are burning fuel make mistakes. Zoe turned that over, looked back at the road. Okay, she said. 3 days. Sophie had made herself entirely at home by the time they got back. She had claimed the small backyard by the simple expedient of being in it, sitting on the back steps with her colored pencils and a sketchbook she'd apparently found in her bag, working on something with the focused absorption she brought to things she actually cared about. When Seth and Zoe came through the back gate, she looked up briefly, assessed that nothing catastrophic had occurred, and went back to her drawing. How'd it go? She asked, without looking up. Okay, Seth said. Zoe, do you know how to draw horses? Zoe looked slightly thrown by the gear shift. Not very well. That's fine. Dad can't draw anything. Sophie moved over on the step. Come look. Tell me if this looks like a horse or a weird dog. Zoe glanced at Seth. He shrugged. He'd long ago stopped trying to redirect Sophie when she'd made a decision about something, and went inside to make coffee. Through the kitchen window, he could see the two of them on the back step, Sophie's sketchbook between them, Zoe leaning in and looking and saying something that made Sophie laugh and shake her head. Seth stood at the kitchen window with the water running into the coffee pot and watched, and tried to think about Daniel Crane and Graham Pierce and Richard Baum and evidentiary forensic timelines. He managed it for about 45 seconds. It was Graham Pierce who arrived the next morning, not in person, by process server at 8:50 a.m., a guy in a polo shirt who knocked on Carol Finch's office door and delivered a formal legal demand. Meridian Technologies was requesting the immediate return of what they described as proprietary financial data and internal corporate documentation, citing specifically Zoe Lewis by name, citing specifically documents removed from Meridian systems in the 30 days prior to her suspension. Carol called Zoe on the prepaid at 9:15. It's a pressure move, Carol said. Seth was listening on speaker standing in the safe house kitchen. The demand has no legal force in the way they framed it. The documents you have were created during your tenure as CEO and are not categorically company property in the manner they're asserting. But the intent is to rattle you, to make you think they have more legal firepower than they do. Do they? Zoe asked. They have Graham Pierce, Carol said dryly, who is expensive and presentable and whose primary skill is making people feel like they're already defeated. What they don't have, as of this morning, is a clear legal basis to compel you to produce anything before we've had discovery. A brief pause. My forensic accountant worked through most of last night. He's found 3 separate accounts that show movement inconsistent with any authorized expense report filed during the relevant period. It's not complete yet, but it's enough to begin building the counter-narrative. Zoe's eyes moved to Seth's across the kitchen. What about the board? Zoe asked. Baum called me this morning, too. He wants to expedite the meeting. Carol paused. Zoe, I want to give you my honest read. I think 2 things are true simultaneously. 1, Daniel's position is weaker than it looks because the financial irregularities are going to surface no matter what he does now. The original plan relied on you folding quickly or being discredited fast enough that no serious investigation would get traction. That window is closing for him. 2. The board is not on your side. They're on their own side. If they're moving toward you now, it's because they believe you're the least expensive solution to a problem that is threatening their investment, not because they think justice requires it. So what do I do? Zoe said. You meet with Baum, Carol said, but you meet him on your terms and from a position of documented evidence, not desperation. I'd like another 48 hours with the accountant's findings before you walk into that room. Zoe looked at Seth. He nodded once. 48 hours, Zoe said. Then we meet him. Done. The 48 hours were not quiet. Pierce sent 2 more legal communications, each slightly more pointed than the last. The escalation calibrated and professional and designed to create the impression of an inevitably closing door. Carol responded to each one with a brevity that Seth, who read the responses when Zoe showed him, found satisfying but short, flat, exact, the legal equivalent of a closed door. On the first evening, Daniel Crane's name appeared in a brief item in a Seattle Business News aggregator. Meridian Technologies interim CEO consolidates board relationships amid ongoing management transition. The language was careful, and the sourcing was unnamed, and Seth read it and understood immediately that it was a plant, someone feeding a narrative to a sympathetic journalist to establish Daniel's legitimacy on the record before anything else made it onto the record. He's scared, Seth said. Zoe was reading the same item on her laptop. How do you know? Because he wouldn't burn a press contact on something this vague if he wasn't. Seth set down the phone. A man who's confident he's won doesn't need to tell anyone he's winning. On the second evening, Sophie made dinner. She'd asked Zoe to teach her something that didn't involve pasta, and they'd made a soup from things that were in the kitchen: onions, canned tomatoes, some chicken stock, a handful of rice, that was imperfect in the way that things made without a recipe always are. Too much salt initially corrected with a squeeze of lemon that Sophie found in the back of the refrigerator, a slightly uneven texture that didn't matter because the flavor was good enough to cover it. They ate it at the table, the 3 of them, and Sophie talked about a fight she'd had with her best friend at school the previous week over something that had already been resolved, but that Sophie still wanted to process. And Zoe listened and asked actual questions. Not the adult performance of listening to a child, but the real version, the version where you're actually tracking what's being said. And Seth watched the 2 of them and thought about what it meant that this woman, who had been a stranger 4 days ago, had slotted into the specific shape of their evenings like she'd always been meant to be there. He didn't let himself go too far with that thought. There was too much unresolved, too many moving pieces, too much that could still fall apart in the next 48 hours. But he didn't push the thought away entirely either. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Seth and Zoe sat in the small living room with the lamp on and the rest of the house quiet, and Zoe said, "Tell me about the mission." Seth looked at her. "The one you don't talk about," she said. "The one you left the teams over." She held his gaze, calm, direct, not pressing. "You don't have to, but I'd like to know." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, somewhere a few streets over, a car alarm went off and then stopped. "Afghanistan," he said. 2018. He looked at his hands. "We were extracting a family. Father, mother, 3 kids. They'd been informants for us for 2 years and they'd been compromised. We went in to get them out." He stopped. "We got in fine. The extraction went wrong on the way out. There was a route failure. A road we thought was clear wasn't. We had to choose between the primary route and a secondary it was faster, but it went through a market area. Population density." He stopped again. Looked at the wall above the lamp. "I made the call to take the secondary," he said. "It was the right tactical call. I'd make the same call again, probably, with the same information." He paused. "We hit a roadside device in the market. The mother didn't make it. One of the kids lost a hand." He said it flat, without modulation, the way you say things when you've been saying them to yourself for years and all the texture has worn off, and what's left is just the shape of it. "We got the rest of them out. Father, 2 kids. The mission was technically a success." Zoe was very still. I put in for my discharge papers 8 weeks later, Seth said. Technically, I cited personal reasons, which was true. He looked at her finally. Sophie was 4. She'd already lost her mother 6 months earlier. I told myself I was doing it for her. And? Zoe said quietly. And I was, partly. He was quiet. But partly I didn't want to make that call again. The right call that leaves someone's mother in a market in Kandahar. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. I'd made calls like that before and gone back the next day. That time I couldn't. Zoe didn't say I'm sorry. She didn't say that wasn't your fault or any of the other things people say, which Seth had always found required him to perform gratitude for something that didn't actually help. She said nothing for a moment. Then, the weight of a right call. He looked at her. There's a specific kind of weight, she said, when you did everything correctly and it still cost something irreplaceable. It doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels worse than a mistake, because you can't even be angry at yourself properly. Seth looked at her. Something about the precision of it, the way she'd named it without softening it. Yeah, he said. That's it. They sat in the quiet for a while, not an uncomfortable quiet, the kind that comes after something true has been said and there's nothing required to follow it. What you said to me, Zoe said after a while, about rebuilding mattering more than reclaiming, did you figure that out? Or are you still working on it? Seth looked at the lamp. Still working on it. Good, she said. Me too. Richard Baum's assistant called on the second morning and proposed a meeting at Meridian's headquarters the following day. Carol Finch counterproposed a neutral location, a conference room at her firm, and Baum accepted, which told Seth that Baum wanted the meeting enough to accept terms he hadn't set. The forensic accountant delivered his preliminary findings to Carol late that afternoon. 4 accounts with demonstrably irregular movement, 3 expense reports with signatures that didn't match the authorized signatory database, and 2 wire transfers to an LLC that did not appear in any of Meridian's registered vendor documentation, totaling just over $600,000. Preliminary. Not complete, but enough. Carol sent Zoe the summary on a secure file transfer, and Zoe read it at the kitchen table in the safe house with Seth and Sophie on either side of her. Sophie theoretically doing homework, but mostly watching Zoe's face for information. And when she finished reading, she closed the laptop and sat with her hands flat on the table and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "It's enough." "Enough to expose him?" Seth said. "Enough to walk into that boardroom and not be afraid." She looked up. "He built this whole thing on the assumption that I'd be too destabilized to fight back clearly. 3 weeks of isolation, frozen accounts, legal harassment, people in alleys." She paused. "He miscalculated." "He miscalculated the night he sent those 3 men," Seth said. Something in Zoe's expression shifted. The particular shift of someone who has been carrying something heavy, finally setting it down and looking at it from outside. "What do I do if they offer me the CEO position?" she said. "For real this time. What do I actually do?" Seth looked at her. Looked at the question behind the question, which was the real one. "You already know," he said. She was quiet. "You've known for a couple of days," he said. "You're asking me because you want someone to confirm it's okay to know it." Sophie looked up from her homework and looked at Zoe with the serious, steady eyes and said nothing, which was its own kind of confirmation. Zoe looked at the closed laptop. At the preliminary findings underneath it, months of Daniel's crimes laid out in the clean language of numbers. At Seth across the table and Sophie beside her, and the small, ordinary kitchen of a house that had no meaning except that it was safe and honest and free of performance. She nodded once, slowly. "Okay," she said. It was the kind of okay that meant something bigger than okay. Seth heard it that way. Sophie, he suspected, heard it too. Outside, the afternoon had turned clear. One of those Seattle moments when the clouds move and what's underneath them is more blue than you remembered blue could be, sharp and clean and going all the way up. The morning of the board meeting arrived gray and cold, the kind of Seattle morning that commits to its mood without apology. Zoe was up at 5:30. Seth heard her in the kitchen. The particular quiet of someone trying not to make noise in someone else's space, the careful placement of the coffee pot, the soft close of a cabinet. He lay in the other bedroom for a few minutes, listening to those small sounds, and then got up. She was standing at the kitchen window in the dark, with a mug in both hands, still in the oversized t-shirt she'd slept in, hair unresolved, staring at the backyard where the first thin light was beginning to work at the edges of things. She heard him come in and didn't turn around. "I keep running it," she said. "Running what?" "The meeting, the boardroom." She turned the mug in her hands. "All the things Baum might say, all the ways it might go wrong." Seth went to the coffee pot and poured himself a mug. "What version are you on?" 4, maybe 5? She finally turned from the window. She looked tired in the honest way. Not the performed exhaustion of someone claiming a difficult week, but the genuine kind that shows around the eyes and in the way a person holds their shoulders. "In 3 of them, he offers me the position, and I say no, and it goes fine. In 1, he offers me the position, and I say no, and they side with Daniel anyway." She paused. "In the last one, I say yes." Seth looked at her over his mug. Which one felt true? She was quiet for a moment. 3, she said. "The one where I say no, and it goes fine." A pause. "And 5. The yes one." "I know." She said it with a kind of rueful flatness. "I know, Seth. I am aware of what that means about what I still want." Seth sat down at the table. "Wanting it isn't the problem." "Then what's the problem?" "Wanting it for the wrong reasons is the problem." He set the mug down. "There's a version of going back where you're going back to prove something. To Daniel, to the board, to every room that ever doubted you. And there's a version where you go back because you genuinely believe it's the right next thing for your life." He paused. "The first version will eat you the same way it ate you before. The second one might be different." Zoe looked at him with an expression that had too many things in it to name cleanly. "And you know which version I'm in?" she said. "No," Seth said honestly. "Do you?" She turned back to the window. The backyard was lightening by small degrees, the birch tree becoming visible at the fence line, the grass wet with dew that would probably burn off by 9. "I know which version I was in 3 weeks ago," she said. "Before all of this?" She paused. "I'm not sure who I am now." "That's not a bad place to be," Seth said. "Uncertain is better than wrong." She looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not a smile exactly, but the territory adjacent to one. "You always say something like that right when I'm about to spiral." "I've noticed the spiral has about a 30-second run-up," Seth said. "It's not hard to time." She laughed, a real one, brief and surprised, and it moved through the kitchen and changed the room slightly, the way real laughter does. Sophie appeared in the doorway in her pajamas and socks, and took in the scene with the thoroughness of her morning assessments. "Why is everyone up already?" she said. "Couldn't sleep," Zoe said. "Me neither," Sophie said, with the authority of someone who clearly had been fully asleep 4 minutes ago. She climbed onto a kitchen chair. "Is today the big meeting?" "Yes," Zoe said. Sophie thought about this. "Are you nervous?" "Yes," Zoe said again. She said it without hesitation, which Sophie appeared to respect. She had a low tolerance for adults pretending things were fine when they weren't. "Dad gets nervous too," Sophie said, with the air of sharing classified information. "He just doesn't show it. His jaw goes tight." She demonstrated clenching her own small jaw in imitation. "Like that." "I do not," Seth started. "You did it twice yesterday." Sophie looked at Zoe. "When the second letter came from the lawyer, and when you went to get more coffee and the pot was empty." "But the pot being empty is not a nervous reaction. That's an objective problem." "Your jaw did the thing." Zoe was looking at Seth with the kind of attention that had amusement underneath it, and something more than amusement underneath that. "Good to know," she said. Carol Finch had reserved the largest of her firm's conference rooms, a corner room on the 14th floor with a long table and a view of the Sound between buildings, the water flat and pewter-colored in the morning light. By the time Seth, Zoe, and Carol were in the room, There were 4 chairs set along one side of the table with printed copies of the forensic accountant's preliminary report in front of each one, along with Carol's formal response to Pierce's legal demands and a 3-page executive summary that Carol had written herself. Seth sat against the wall, not at the table. He'd suggested this to Zoe on the drive over. "You don't need me at the table, you need me in the room." And she'd understood immediately. His presence was structural, not participatory. A reminder, if one was needed, that Zoe Lewis had not arrived at this meeting alone and frightened. Richard Baum arrived at 9:02 with 2 other board members Seth didn't know. One a heavy-set man in his 60s named Peterson, from the brief introduction, and a younger woman named Kim who had the look of someone who had done her homework thoroughly and was now waiting to see if the homework had been worth it. And Graham Pierce, who came in last with the smooth, occupying manner of a man who believed his presence elevated whatever room he entered. Pierce's eyes found Seth immediately. They stayed there for approximately 2 seconds, long enough to register and categorize, and then moved away. Baum was a tall man, mid-70s, with the angular build of someone who had been lean all his life and wasn't fighting it. He had white hair and a quality of deliberateness about his movements that suggested someone who had learned over a long career that the first thing you did in any room was make everyone understand you were not in a hurry. He sat down across from Zoe and looked at her and said, "I owe you an apology." The room shifted slightly. "I voted to freeze your system access," Baum said. "When Daniel brought the board the fraud allegation, I didn't demand a longer review period. I was influenced by the urgency of his presentation and by the material he provided, and I acted too quickly." He paused. "I'm not in the habit of making that kind of mistake, and I should have been more rigorous." Zoe held his gaze. "Thank you," she said, "for saying that." "It's not absolution," Baum said. "It's a statement of fact." He looked at the folder in front of him. "We've reviewed the preliminary forensic findings that Carol shared this morning. I've also had our independent audit committee begin their own review, which started last night." He looked up. "Daniel has been suspended from operational duties pending the outcome of that review." The room absorbed this. Pierce shifted slightly in his seat. Seth watched him. "So he's not here," Zoe said. "Correct." Baum's tone was precise and dry. "Graham is here in his capacity as Meridian's corporate counsel, not as Daniel's personal attorney. That distinction became necessary 48 hours ago." A brief pause that had a history in it. "We would like to discuss the path forward for the company." "Before we do," Carol said, "I want to be clear about the scope of the evidentiary record my client has assembled." She opened her own folder. "What you received this morning is preliminary. The full forensic report will be available within 7 business days, and it is considerably more comprehensive." She looked at Baum directly. "Ms. Lewis did not take company property. She retained records she created and maintained during her tenure, which document a pattern of financial misconduct that has been ongoing for no less than 22 months. She paused. "That will be the basis of a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office, which we will be filing regardless of the outcome of today's meeting." Peterson shifted in his chair. Kim was making notes. "We understand," Baum said. He looked at Zoe again. "Zoe, I want to ask you directly, and I want a direct answer. Do you want to come back?" The room went quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when the question everyone has been circling finally gets said out loud. Seth watched Zoe's face. He saw the thing he'd seen in the kitchen that morning, the 2 versions running parallel, the pull of the familiar against the weight of what she'd learned about herself in the last week. He saw her jaw work slightly, once, and he saw the moment she made the decision, which was not a dramatic moment at all. It was quiet, a small interior settling, like a compass finding north. "No," Zoe said. Baum was still. "I want my name cleared," she said. "I want the forensic record to establish what Daniel did. I want the legal consequences to follow from that, and I want the company I built to survive it, because the people who work at Meridian don't deserve to pay for what 2 of its founders did to each other." She paused. "But I don't want to go back to that office. I don't want to go back to that version of my life." The room was very quiet. "That's going to complicate things," Peterson said. He said it not unkindly, more like someone reading a set of conditions and noting which ones added friction. The succession will complicate things, Carol said. The fraud investigation is going to proceed either way. What Ms. Lewis is telling you is that her cooperation, which will significantly accelerate that investigation, is not contingent on her return to the company. She's prepared to assist the process because it's the right thing to do, not as a bargaining chip. Kim looked up from her notes. She looked at Zoe with an expression that Seth couldn't quite read, something between respect and recalibration. "What do you want instead?" Kim asked. "If not the company." Zoe looked at her. It was the same question Seth had asked her on the sidewalk outside Carol's building and in the kitchen at 5:30 that morning, and in several different forms across the previous week. The question she'd been circling because the answer scared her in a different way than the boardroom did. "I want to build things that are done right from the beginning," Zoe said. "Not rescue operations. Foundations." She paused. "I've been talking to people, informally over the last few years, other founders in early stages, about governance and financial structures that prevent what happened at Meridian from happening to them. I want to do that, formally, an advisory practice, maybe a foundation." She stopped. "I haven't worked out the details. I know that's not a tidy answer for a board meeting." Baum was looking at her with an expression Seth couldn't read, but it wasn't skeptical. It was something more like the face of a man re-encountering something he'd valued and set aside and was now remembering why he valued it. "It's an honest answer," Baum said, "which is more than I've gotten in this room in about 2 years." The meeting ran 2.5 hours. Seth sat against the wall for all of it. He wasn't bored exactly. The architecture of negotiation held a certain interest for him, the way the pressure moved between people. The things that got said obliquely because saying them directly would require someone to own them. Pierce spoke less than Seth had expected, which suggested that Pierce had been briefed on what the forensic report contained and had adjusted his position accordingly. Peterson asked most of the substantive questions. Kim took notes and occasionally asked the kind of clarifying question that sounded innocent and was not. By the end, the framework was this: Meridian's independent audit committee would complete their review within 30 days. Carol's formal complaint to the Attorney General would proceed. Zoe would provide cooperation and access to her documentation. The board would issue a public statement clarifying that the fraud allegations against Zoe Lewis were withdrawn, contingent on the audit committee's confirmation of what the preliminary findings showed. Pierce, on Meridian's behalf, would formally withdraw the legal demand for return of documents. It was not everything. It was not neat. There were contingencies and timelines and things that could still go wrong. But when Baum stood at the end and extended his hand across the table to Zoe, and Zoe took it, Seth recognized the handshake for what it was. Not a resolution, but the first solid ground after a long crossing. In the elevator down with just the three of them, Seth, Zoe, Carol said, "You did well." "Pierce backed down faster than I expected," Zoe said. "Pierce is a professional," Carol said. "When the ground shifts, he shifts with it. He has no personal investment in Daniel winning. He has a professional investment in being on whichever side prevails." She pressed the lobby button. "He'll be equally helpful to us in 3 weeks." Zoe looked at her own reflection in the elevator's steel door. The woman who looked back at her was not the woman who had come to Carol's office a week ago with a split lip and a laptop she was terrified of losing. Something about her had settled, not into ease exactly, but into herself. The posture was the same, straight, set. But it was coming from a different place now. Less performance. More foundation. "Carol," she said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Carol said. "We have 30 days of process ahead of us." But she said it warmly, in the way of someone who finds the process itself worthwhile. Seth said nothing. He stood in the elevator and listened to the cable and thought about what came next. What? What came next was that Pierce's office called Carol at 3 that afternoon with a development neither of them had anticipated. Daniel Crane had resigned, not waited for the audit committee, not fought the suspension. Resigned, effective immediately, with a 2-line statement through Pierce's office citing personal reasons. Pierce had apparently found out 40 minutes before he called Carol, which put the resignation somewhere around noon, approximately 2 hours after the board meeting ended. Carol called Seth's phone to relay the news. He was driving, and he put it on speaker so Zoe could hear. "He ran," Seth said when Carol finished. "It appears so," Carol said. "Why?" Zoe said. She was looking at the windshield with an expression that was hard to parse. Not satisfied. Not quite. "The audit wasn't done. The AG complaint hasn't been filed yet. Why resign now?" "One of two reasons," Seth said. "Either he knows the audit is going to find something worse than the preliminary report shows, and he's trying to get clear before it surfaces. Or someone told him this morning that the board was no longer protecting him, and he decided the exposure risk changed." "The second one," Carol said from the phone. "My best guess, Pierce spent 2 hours in that meeting watching the board distance themselves from Daniel in real time. If Pierce reported back accurately, and he would have because it's in his interest to be accurate, Daniel understood that he was no longer operating with board cover." A brief pause. "Which doesn't mean the investigation goes away. It means he's now running from it alone." Zoe was quiet for a moment. "He really thought I'd fold," she said. Not angry, more like someone finally reading the fine print on something they signed a long time ago. "He knew me for 6 years, and he thought 3 weeks of legal pressure and empty accounts, and—" She stopped. "He thought that would be enough. People who've watched you work tend to underestimate how much of it comes from you and how much from the position," Seth said. "They see the CEO and they think that's what you are. They take away the title and they think they've taken away the thing." She looked at him. "They hadn't," he said. She looked at the road ahead, quiet for a long stretch. Then, "I want to go somewhere. Not back to the safe house. Somewhere outside. Open." A pause. "Is that possible?" Seth thought about it. Not long. "Yeah," he said. "I know a place." Chat. He drove them north and east, out of the city proper, up through the foothills where the trees got serious and the road narrowed and the buildings fell away and the sky came back. Sophie, who had been at school and was now in the back seat with her backpack and her colored pencils, watched the trees with the calm pleasure of a child who was fine going anywhere, as long as the destination was eventually explained. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Family cabin," Seth said, "near Cascade Lake. My uncle left it to me. I haven't been up in a while." "How long is a while?" 2 years. Sophie absorbed this with the knowing silence of someone who understood that 2 years of not going somewhere was information about more than scheduling. The cabin was 40 minutes up a Forest Service road off the main highway. 2-track gravel that the truck handled without complaint, the trees closing in on either side and then opening onto a cleared half-acre with a small structure that had weathered to silver gray and had a covered porch facing the water. The lake was visible through the trees, flat and dark green, the mountains on the far side still carrying patches of late snow on their upper ridge lines. Seth unlocked the cabin and pushed the door open, and the smell of it came out. Wood smoke, old cedar, the particular closed-up smell of a space that had been waiting. Inside was spare. 2 rooms, a wood stove, a kitchen with a hand pump and a gas burner, 2 sets of bunk beds, a table with 4 mismatched chairs, a shelf of paperback novels left by various people over various years, a set of fishing poles leaning in the corner. "This is amazing," Sophie said, looking around with the frank assessment of a 9-year-old who meant it without sentimentality. "It's old," Seth said. "That's what I said." She was already touching things, the fishing poles, the paperbacks, the iron handle of the wood stove. "Can we fish?" "Maybe tomorrow." "I've never fished." "I know." "Zoe, have you ever fished?" Zoe was standing in the doorway, taking in the room. She looked slightly like a person who had arrived somewhere unexpected and was adjusting to the coordinates. "No," she said. "We can all learn together," Sophie announced, in the tone of someone making an executive decision. Seth got the wood stove going in 20 minutes. Birch from the stack on the porch, paper from a box on the shelf, the particular sequence of kindling and air management that came back to him the way things at the cabin always came back, layered over the ordinary forgetting of years. The room warmed by degrees. Zoe found the gas burner and heated water for tea from a tin she'd found in the cabinet, and Sophie organized the bunk beds with her characteristic proprietary efficiency and claimed the top bunk on the Lakeview side without consultation. They ate dinner around the table, canned soup that Seth had brought from the truck, crackers, the apples Sophie had packed in her bag without being asked, and the conversation moved at its own pace without anyone managing it. Sophie talked about a book she was reading. Zoe asked questions. Seth made the soup and ate it and listened. After Sophie was asleep, quickly, the way children sleep in places that smell like outside, Seth and Zoe sat on the porch in the cold with mugs of tea and the lake visible through the trees, very still in the dark, catching the light from a half moon that had come up over the eastern ridge. "I didn't know this existed," Zoe said. "Not a lot of people do." "Have you brought Sophie here before?" "A few times when she was younger. Right after, He paused. "Right after her mother died, we came up for a week. She was too young to know what we were really doing here." "What were you really doing?" Seth looked at the lake. "Getting through a week." Zoe held her mug in both hands, nodded slowly. "My parents had a place," she said. "Nothing like this. A cousin's house in Lake Erie, Ohio. We'd go in the summers when I was a kid, before the dry cleaning business got big enough to make summers busy." She paused. "My dad would fish off the dock, badly. He'd catch nothing for 3 hours and then come in and tell my mother about the ones that got away, and she'd roll her eyes, but she'd listen, every time." A small pause. "I think about that sometimes, how little it took to make those summers work." Seth glanced at her profile in the dark. "When did you stop having summers?" She thought about it. "Sophomore year of college, I got an internship, then another one. Then I stayed in the city over the following summer to work on the early meridian concept with Daniel." She paused. "I thought I was being disciplined, serious. I thought I was proving something." "You were 20, Seth said. "Yes." Dry, a little sad. "I was 20. The lake was very quiet. Somewhere far off, water moved against the shore in a slow, rhythmic sound that was almost but not quite silence. "What do you want to do tomorrow?" Zoe asked. "If we have a day without Pierce calling, without the board, without any of it." Seth thought. "Same thing we did today, nothing in particular." She looked at him. "You don't have nothing in particular." "I have it here." She was quiet for a moment. "You could come back here more, you and Sophie." "Yeah." He turned his mug in his hands. "I stopped coming because it reminded me of the years when we came as a family, when Claire was alive." He paused. "Which is a bad reason not to go to a place you love." Zoe didn't respond immediately. Then, "How long does that take? The transition from a place that hurts to a place that's just yours?" "I don't know. Still working on it." He looked at the lake. "But tonight it's mostly just a lake." She looked at the lake too. For a long time, neither of them said anything. And the nothing in particular of it was in fact something that didn't need naming. They stayed 3 days. Not by plan. The first day stretched into an evening that was too good to leave, and the second day had fishing in it. Seth teaching Sophie and Zoe the basics off the small dock, an exercise in patience and imprecision that Sophie attacked with determined optimism, and Zoe approached with the studied focus of someone who was used to being competent and found genuine surprise in being bad at something. Nobody caught anything of consequence. Sophie caught a small perch that she immediately and thoroughly photographed from every angle before releasing it with ceremony. Zoe got her line tangled twice and fixed it herself the second time, and the satisfaction on her face when she did was disproportionate to the achievement and entirely genuine. Seth sat on the dock and held his rod and watched them, and did not think about Daniel Crane. On the second evening, Sophie went to bed early, worn out from the lake air and the fishing and the general intensity of days without screens, and Seth and Zoe sat at the table inside with the wood stove going and a map of the Cascade Range that Seth had found in a drawer, because Zoe had asked about the peaks visible from the dock, and Seth actually knew them. "This one," he said, pointing, "the double summit. That's a technical climb above about 6,000 feet, but the approach is a good day hike. Have you done it?" "Twice. Once in the teams with a group, once alone after I got out." After you got out? She looked at the map. How far up? About 8,000. Turned back before the technical section. I was alone and I didn't have the gear. Why alone? He looked at the map. It was the first summer without Claire. Sophie was with her grandparents for 2 weeks. I needed to go somewhere I couldn't think about anything except the next step. Zoe was quiet. Did it work? She asked. For about 6 hours, he said. Which was enough. She nodded, understanding it precisely. I ran, she said, after my father had his first heart attack 3 years ago. He was fine, he recovered, but I got the call at 2 in the morning and drove to the hospital in Cleveland and sat in a waiting room for 4 hours. And when he came out okay, I went back to my hotel room and I didn't know what to do with all of it. She paused. So I opened my laptop and worked for 6 hours. That's what I did with it. Seth looked at her. I know, she said, reading his face. I know. But it was what I had. She looked at the map. I didn't have a mountain. I had a laptop. You're here now, Seth said. No laptop. I have the laptop. A small smile. It's just not open. Progress? Seth said. She laughed, and it was easier this time than the first time she'd laughed in his kitchen, more settled in, like something that had found its place. Tell me something else, she said. About the teams. Not a mission, something ordinary. He thought. There was a guy in my unit, Delgado. Enormous man, 6'4", could break a door off its hinges, terrified of birds. Seth said this with complete neutrality. Not big birds, any bird. A pigeon could clear a table faster than a fire alarm. That's not possible. Mission brief in Bahrain, a seagull landed on the windowsill. I have never seen a man in full kit move that fast. She was laughing now, properly, and it moved around the small cabin and touched everything in it, and Seth found himself laughing too. Not the performed version, the real one, the kind that comes from somewhere lower down and lasts longer than it needs to. What happened to him? She asked. Delgado? Got out 2 years before me. He runs a fishing charter in Florida. Seth shook his head, which I find funny every time I think about it. Because of the birds? Seagulls are everywhere in Florida. Oh no. He says he's fine with it now. I don't believe him. She was still smiling, and the fire in the wood stove was doing its low, settled work, and the map was on the table between them with its clean topographic lines, showing all the places the land did things. And outside the lake was doing what it did, which was be a lake, quiet and permanent, and entirely indifferent to what happened near it. Can I ask you something? Zoe said. Yeah. When this is over, when the investigation runs its course, and the AG files whatever they file, and it's done, she paused. What does your life look like? Seth looked at the map. Same as before, probably. Repair shop, Sophie, the stuck door. The what? The front door of my apartment sticks. I've been meaning to fix it. For how long? About a year. She looked at him with an expression that was affectionate in a way that seemed to surprise her slightly. That seems like an easy thing to fix. The thing you live with is always the last thing you fix, Seth said. She held his gaze for a moment, longer than necessary. The wood stove ticked. The lake outside did nothing. I meant, with Sophie, She stopped, reorganized. Are you happy? In the repair shop, in the apartment with the stuck door? Is that what you want? He thought about it honestly. It's what I built because I needed it. Whether it's still what I need, I'm less sure. He paused. Sophie deserves someone who's actually present, not just physically there. He turned the mug in his hands. I've been there. I haven't always been present. You were present every time I watched you with her, Zoe said. That's the last 5 days. 5 days is data. It's not a lot of data. Sometimes it's enough to show you the direction. She looked at the map, then back at him. Seth, what do you actually want? He sat with the question, not performing consideration but actually sitting with it, the way the cabin sat with everything, holding it without judgment, waiting. I want to stop carrying the mission that went wrong, he said finally. I want to be in a room and not be counting exits. He paused. I want Sophie to have someone in her corner who isn't also halfway somewhere else. Another pause. Longer. I want... He stopped. What? He looked at her. The firelight from the stove caught the side of her face, and she was looking at him with something open in her expression, something that had been underneath the CEO architecture all along, and was now simply present, without the layers. Things that are probably premature to want, he said. Zoe looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, complicated and layered and not resolved, the face of a person who is standing at the edge of something and is not quite ready to step but is no longer moving away. Okay, she said softly. It wasn't agreement or rejection. It was acknowledgement, the particular honest acknowledgement of two people who understood that some things needed more than 5 days and more than a lakeside cabin and more than one resolved crisis to become sayable. Okay, Seth said. They sat with the fire and the map and the lake beyond the wall, and it was enough for now, and they both knew it was enough for now, and neither of them needed it to be more than that tonight. But on the third morning, Carol called. Seth was on the dock with a coffee mug and the early lake mist still lying flat on the water when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He picked up. The audit committee has fast-tracked, Carol said. Her voice had a particular briskness that meant good news delivered efficiently. They found 2 things we didn't have in the preliminary report. First, a third-party entity, an LLC registered in Nevada, that Daniel used as a pass-through for just over $1.2 million in diverted funds. Second, and more significant, emails. Internal communications between Daniel and Pierce that strongly suggest Pierce was aware of at least some of the diversions and helped structure the LLC to minimize traceability. Seth was quiet for a moment. Pierce is exposed. Significantly, he's already retained separate personal counsel, which tells you everything about his current read on his own situation. A brief pause. The Attorney General's office reached out to Carol's office last evening. They'd received a preliminary referral from the audit committee, and they want to move quickly. They're talking about a formal investigation announcement within 2 weeks. What does Zoe need to do? Meet with the AG's investigator, provide access to the documentation. Carol will handle the logistics. Another pause. Seth, it's moving toward resolution. Not a clean one because these things are never clean. But Daniel resigned into an investigation that now has subpoena power. That changes the exposure calculus considerably. Seth looked at the lake. The mist was breaking up now, the water coming clear beneath it, the far mountains becoming defined in the morning light. I'll tell her, he said. He stayed on the dock for another few minutes after he hung up, holding the mug and watching the lake emerge from the mist. A heron was working the shallows at the north end. Slow, deliberate, its whole body an exercise in stillness interrupted by precise, committed action. It struck twice in the time Seth watched it. Got something on the second strike. He walked back up to the cabin. Zoe was on the porch with her own coffee, her legs pulled up under her in the chair, watching the same water Seth had been watching. She saw his face when he came up the steps, and she set her mug down and straightened slightly, reading him. Good news? She said. Getting there, Seth said. He sat in the other chair and told her what Carol had said. The LLC, the emails, Pierce's separate counsel, the AG's office. He said it clean and straight, without embellishment, the way you delivered a situation report to someone who needed information, not theater. When he finished, Zoe was quiet for a moment. Pierce, she said. Yeah. He was in our board meetings. He helped negotiate the government contract. She stared at the water. He sat across from me and... She stopped. I keep thinking I should be used to this. The people who were in the room, but it's supposed to keep doing that, Seth said. That's not weakness. That's... He paused. You don't get used to betrayal without becoming something you don't want to be. She looked at him. You should still feel it, he said. Just don't let it make the decisions. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and picked up her coffee. The lake was fully clear now. The heron was gone. The mountains were out, sharp and white and impossibly clean against the morning blue, and Sophie's voice came from inside the cabin, talking to herself in the way she did when she thought no one could hear, narrating something private and unhurried. Zoe listened to Sophie's voice and looked at the mountains and sat with whatever she was carrying, and Seth sat beside her, and neither of them said anything for a long time, which was its own kind of resolution. Not final, not complete, but real. They would go back. Tomorrow, probably. The investigation needed Zoe, and Seattle needed them to return to it, and the stuck door and the repair shop and the rest of ordinary life were where this was all eventually going to have to land. But the morning existed before any of that, and the lake existed, and Sophie's voice was still going in the cabin, and the coffee was still warm, and that was what there was right now, and right now was enough. They drove back to Seattle on a Tuesday morning with the mountains behind them and the city ahead, and the transition happened the way transitions always do. Gradually, and then all at once, the trees thinning, the road widening, the first subdivisions appearing at the highway's edge, and then the bridges and the water and the familiar gray geometry of a city that had been running without them for 3 days and hadn't noticed. Sophie fell asleep again in the back seat. She had a talent for sleeping in moving vehicles that Seth had always considered one of her more useful qualities. Zoe watched the city come toward them from the passenger seat without speaking. Seth drove. The radio was off. The heater moved air through the cab in a low, steady sound, and outside the morning was doing what Seattle mornings did, withholding judgment. "I don't want to go back to the safe house," Zoe said. Seth glanced at her. "I want to go to your apartment," she said. If that's okay." "It's okay," Seth said. She looked at the windshield. "I know it doesn't make logical sense. The safe house is more secure. Pierce is lawyering up for himself now. Daniel's running from a subpoena. Nobody's sending anyone after you anymore." "I know that too." She paused. I want to go back to where this started. I don't know how to explain it better than that." Seth looked at the road. "You don't have to explain it." She turned and looked at him in a way he felt rather than saw. The full, direct attention of it. "Thank you," she said. Not for the driving. They both understood that. He nodded once and drove. The apartment door stuck the same as always. Seth put his shoulder into it the same way he always did, and it opened, and the apartment was exactly as they'd left it. The slightly dim lighting, the kitchen with its reliable clutter, Sophie's colored pencil drawings still held to the refrigerator with magnets, the pull-out couch folded back to its daytime configuration. The ordinary permanence of a life. Sophie came in and dropped her bag in the hallway without breaking stride and announced she was hungry, and Seth made toast, and the three of them ate standing at the kitchen counter because no one had the energy to make it to the table, and it was exactly as domestic and unremarkable as it sounds. Later that afternoon, while Sophie was at school, Seth had called ahead, late arrival, teacher accommodating as always, Zoe sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and the forensic accountant's full report, which Carol had forwarded that morning, and Seth sat across from her with coffee and the particular patience of a man who was used to waiting for the moment when the action actually started. The report was comprehensive, 83 pages. The forensic accountant, a man named Howard Lyle, who Carol had described as meticulous to the point of personal inconvenience, had traced 22 months of irregular transactions through 6 accounts, the Nevada LLC, and 2 subsidiary accounts that Daniel had opened using signatory authority he'd been granted for a completely different operational purpose and had never disclosed to the board. Total diverted, just under $2 million. The emails between Daniel and Pierce, subpoenaed by the AG's office, filled in the intent. A deliberate strategy, documented in careful corporate euphemism, to position Daniel as the operational center of Meridian and marginalize Zoe's authority by whatever means available. The fraud was initially incidental, a way to build a separate financial cushion, and became central when Daniel realized how much exposure it created and decided that making Zoe the liability was cleaner than stopping. Zoe read through the report without speaking. Seth watched her face cycle through things he didn't try to name. The particular expressions of a person reading the documented proof of something they'd suspected and hoped and feared was true, the complicated relief of confirmation, the specific exhaustion of being right about something you'd have preferred to be wrong about. When she closed the laptop, she sat with her hands flat on the table and stared at the kitchen wall. $2 million, she said. Yeah. He risked everything. The company, his reputation, 6 years of what we built, for $2 million. She shook her head. Not in disbelief, in the tone of someone arriving at a conclusion they'd been approaching from a distance. I keep thinking he must have had a bigger reason, something more, I don't know, sophisticated. But it's just $2 million and a need to be the most important person in the room. Most things collapse to something smaller than you thought, Seth said, when you finally get to the center of them. She looked at him. Is that true for the good things too? He thought about it. No, he said. The good things tend to be bigger than you expected, when you finally let yourself close enough to see them clearly. She held his gaze for a moment. Something passed between them that neither of them commented on, both of them choosing, by unspoken agreement, to let it exist without being named yet. I have to meet with the AG's investigator tomorrow, she said. I know, Carol's going with you. You don't need to come. I know. Will you anyway? Yeah, Seth said. I'll be in the lobby. She looked at him. Something in her expression was very quiet and very direct, and more honest than almost anything she'd said out loud across the last 10 days. Okay, she said. The meeting with the AG's investigator lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Seth sat in the lobby of the state office building on Cherry Street with a paper cup of coffee and a magazine about recreational boating that he had no interest in and read approximately none of. And at 12:50, Zoe and Carol came out of the elevator, and Carol looked like a woman who had spent 3 hours and 40 minutes in complete command of a room. And Zoe looked like someone who had just put down something she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it had a shape. How'd it go? Seth said, standing. Well, Carol said, the investigator is competent and thorough, and she has access to the subpoenaed communications, which means Zoe's documentation fills in gaps rather than carrying the entire case. She glanced at Zoe. Tell him the other thing. Zoe looked at Seth. The investigator mentioned that Daniel's attorney reached out to the AG's office this morning. Preliminary conversation about cooperation. Which means, he's going to cut a deal, Seth said. He's going to try. Carol's tone suggested she had opinions about what that deal should and shouldn't contain. The nature of any agreement will be between his counsel and the AG's office, but what it means for Zoe's purposes is that the case against him is strong enough that he's no longer contesting the facts. He's contesting the consequences. Seth looked at Zoe. It's over, she said. Not triumphantly, with the flat honesty of someone for whom the word over contained a lot of different things. Not fully. There'll be months of process, but the part where I was the suspect, the part where I was running. She paused. That's done. Seth nodded. The AG's office will issue a formal statement, Carol said, clarifying that Ms. Lewis is not a subject of their investigation and that the allegations filed against her have been withdrawn. That goes out tomorrow. She looked at Zoe. Your name is clear, officially. Zoe stood in the lobby of the state office building with marble floors and recycled air and fluorescent lighting, and she did not look like a woman who had just won something. She looked like a woman who was figuring out what to do with her hands, now that they didn't need to be holding on to anything anymore. Seth recognized the feeling from the outside. He'd had it himself, the strange unmooring of a threat that disappears and leaves you standing in a space that suddenly has no edges to push against. He didn't say anything about it. He handed her his coffee because hers had run out somewhere on the 3rd floor, and she took it without thinking and drank it and then looked at the cup. This is terrible, she said. Lobby coffee, he said. Why does lobby coffee always taste like this? It's a federal requirement, Seth said. Keeps meetings short. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her face broke slightly. Not into sadness, but into a kind of release. The face of someone finally breathing fully after a long period of shallow. Carol excused herself with the efficiency of someone who understood when a room had changed purpose, and Seth and Zoe walked out of the building and onto Cherry Street, where the afternoon had decided to be genuinely good. Real Seattle blue overhead, the kind that came maybe 40 days a year and made everyone slightly suspicious of it. And they walked without a particular destination because neither of them had one. 3 weeks later, Daniel Crane entered into a cooperation agreement with the State Attorney General's office. In exchange for a full accounting of the diverted funds and testimony against Graham Pierce, who was facing his own charges related to the LLC structuring, Daniel accepted a plea arrangement that included disgorgement of the $2 million, a 5-year ban from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company, and 18 months of supervised release. Pierce negotiated separately and received harsher terms. 28 months, because the emails had been unambiguous and his involvement had been active rather than facilitated. The Meridian Technologies Board issued a public statement restoring Zoe Lewis's reputation and acknowledging that the fraud allegations against her had been unfounded and procedurally improper. Richard Baum called Zoe personally to deliver the statement before it went public, which she had not expected and which she told Seth about that evening in a tone that was neither forgiving nor entirely unforgiving, somewhere in the complicated middle country between what people deserve and what you're able to give them. The government contract renewal proceeded. Meridian brought in an interim CEO with a clean record and a mandate to stabilize, and the board began a search for permanent leadership that would take most of the following year. The company survived, which was what Zoe had said she wanted for it, and which turned out to actually be what she wanted for it, not because it vindicated her, but because 1,200 people who had no stake in what Daniel and Pierce had done still came to work every morning and did their jobs. And they deserved for the institution to remain standing. Carol sent Zoe a bottle of wine with a card that said, "Next case and nothing else," which was the most Carol thing that had ever happened. And Zoe put the wine in Seth's refrigerator and told Sophie they were saving it for when something worth celebrating happened. Sophie said, "What counts as worth celebrating?" "I'll know it when it comes," Zoe said. Sophie accepted this with more patience than Seth would have expected. What followed was not a clean resolution. It was messier than that, the way actual things are messy, with loose ends and half-resolved emotions and the ordinary difficulty of two people who have lived through something together trying to figure out what they are to each other on the other side of it. Zoe kept a hotel room for the first week back in Seattle. A different hotel, nice but not extravagant, the kind where she could think without the thinking becoming performance. She had dinner with Seth and Sophie 3 times that week, and on the 4th night she brought takeout without being asked, and Sophie opened the door and said, "Good, I was worried it was going to be Dad's cooking," and that was the last night she stayed at the hotel. She found an apartment in Eastlake in the 2nd week, a proper one, lease and everything, her own space with her name on the door, and a kitchen she could cook in and windows that looked out over the water. She needed it. Not from Seth or Sophie, but from the previous version of herself. The one who had lived in the Meridian corner office and the penthouse above it, and the car service between them. The version whose entire architecture had been about proving something to someone she could no longer identify. She needed her own door and her own keys, and the particular sovereignty of a space that was nobody's expectations but hers. Seth helped her move in on a Saturday. Ray Castillo came too, unrequested but correct. Showed up with his truck and a case of beer and a willingness to carry furniture without commentary that Seth found characteristically useful. Sophie directed traffic with the authority of someone who had moved apartments before, and held opinions about where furniture should go. "The couch should face the window," Sophie said. "I think I want it facing the—" Zoe started. "The window," Sophie said. "Trust me." Zoe looked at Seth. "Just agree," Seth said. "It'll be faster." The couch faced the window. It was, in fact, the right call. The advisory practice Zoe had described to the Meridian board, the thing she'd said with some uncertainty, the thing she hadn't fully worked out, began to work itself out over those weeks. She started with 2 calls, founders she'd met at conferences over the years who'd heard about what had happened with Meridian and reached out. She'd expected to give them platitudes. Instead, she found herself going deep into the structural questions. How you build governance that doesn't depend on trust alone. How you protect a company from its own leadership. How you establish financial controls that catch problems before they become catastrophes. She knew all of it from the inside now, in the way you only know something after it's been used against you. The 3rd call turned into a paid engagement, the 4th into a referral. By the end of the 2nd month, she had 6 active clients and a waiting list of 2, and no office, and no employees, and a laptop and a kitchen table and the Eastlake apartment windows with their view of the water. She told Seth about it one evening when Sophie was doing homework in the other room and they were washing dishes in the kitchen. Something they'd fallen into doing together without discussing it. The division of labor that develops between people who share a space enough times that roles stop being assigned and start being intuitive. It doesn't feel like a company yet, she said. It feels like talking to people. Is that worse? Seth said. No. She dried a plate. That's what's strange. It feels better. It feels like something is actually exchanged rather than managed. Seth handed her another plate. What's the difference? Management is when you're controlling the outcome. Exchange is when both sides actually change. She paused. I spent 12 years managing everything. I'm not sure I exchanged much. Seth thought about that. You exchanged something in the alley, he said. She looked at him. You couldn't manage what was happening. You couldn't control the outcome. He looked at the dish in his hand. You just needed help, and you let someone help you. I didn't have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Seth said. You could have fought them yourself. You could have run when I showed up. You could have not told me anything. He looked at her. You let it happen. She was quiet for a moment, the dish still in her hands. I was terrified, she said. I know. I'm not usually... She stopped, looked at the dish. I built an entire company on the principle that I could handle anything that came at me. That I didn't need... She stopped again. A short exhale. That was exhausting, she said very quietly. 12 years of not needing anything. Seth set the last dish in the rack, turned off the tap, turned to look at her in the kitchen of his apartment with the slightly dim light overhead and Sophie's voice in the other room working through a math problem out loud. I know, he said again. Not condescending, just, I know. I did the same thing. We're the same kind of stubborn, you and I. She looked at him for a long moment. Seth. Yeah. I'm not going to say something dramatic, she said. Okay. I'm just going to say that this... She paused and gestured slightly with the dish towel, indicating the kitchen, the apartment, Sophie's voice, the stuck door, everything. This is the best I've felt in a very long time, and I wanted to say it out loud to someone. Seth looked at her, the quiet, unhurried attention that was one of the things she'd come to recognize about him. That he looked at things the way he looked at them, fully, without performing it. Me too, he said. Not elaborate, not dressed up, just true. The door got fixed in the 3rd month. Seth replaced the hinge pin and planed the frame edge on a Saturday morning while Sophie watched and provided commentary, and Zoe sat on the stairs with coffee and observed. The fix took 40 minutes, and afterward the door opened cleanly, without ceremony, on the first push. That's it? Sophie said. That's it, Seth said. You could have done that a year ago. I could have, Seth agreed. Why didn't you? Seth looked at the door, thought about the honest answer. Because fixing the things you live with requires you to decide you're going to keep living there. Sophie processed this with more seriousness than he expected. Then, are you going to keep living here? He looked at Sophie, who was watching him with those 2 old eyes that had always seen more than was offered. He looked at Zoe on the stairs, who had gone still, coffee cup held in both hands, not pushing anything but paying attention. Yeah, Seth said. I am. Sophie looked satisfied. She went inside. The door opened and closed cleanly behind her for the first time in 14 months. Zoe looked at Seth from the stairs. The morning light was coming through the landing window at an angle that caught the steam from her coffee cup, and she looked tired and awake and entirely present, which was the thing he'd come to understand was the version of her he trusted most. She's going to remember this, Zoe said. Sophie, this whole thing, when she's older. Probably, Seth said. What do you think she'll remember most? He sat down on the stairs beside her, thought about it genuinely. The cabin, he said. The fishing. The perch she caught. He paused. And you helping her with the horse drawing that still looked like a weird dog. Zoe laughed. I told her it looked like a horse. It looked like a weird dog. It was an abstract horse. That's a kind description. She smiled and leaned back against the stair wall and looked at the now properly functioning door. Something in her whole body was different from the woman he'd found in the alley on Pike Street on a rainy Thursday. Not fixed, not resolved in the simple sense, but settled. The way a building settles after it's been through something and found its foundation again. "What do you think you'll remember most?" she asked. Seth thought. The alley, obviously. The 11 seconds that had changed everything. Pierce's smooth phone call and the particular satisfaction of hanging up on it. The cabin and the lake and the heron in the shallows at dawn. Zoe on the back step with Sophie's sketchbook between them, the two of them examining an abstract horse with complete mutual seriousness. "This," he said. "The door." "This morning," he said. "Right now. The door working and Sophie inside and coffee getting cold." He paused. "The ordinary version of it." She looked at him, the direct, open look. "People spend a lot of time building toward the extraordinary," she said. "And the extraordinary, when it comes, lasts about 11 seconds. She was quiet. "This is longer than 11 seconds. "Yeah," Seth said. "It is." They sat on the stairs in the hall of his apartment building, and the door to 312 was fixed and closed, and inside Sophie was already doing something that involved moving furniture, from the sound of it, without asking anyone's permission, which was entirely characteristic, and the morning was entirely ordinary, and that was the thing that neither of them would have known to want before. Here's what the story comes down to, if you press on it enough to find the center. Seth Newman spent 5 years building a life small enough that he couldn't fail it. He'd failed people at scale, or believed he had, which amounts to the same weight. And so he reduced the scale. 1 daughter, 1 job, 1 apartment with 1 stuck door. He told himself it was enough, and some days it was. And other days, the space between enough and what he actually wanted was the size of a mountain he'd turned back from before the technical section. Zoe Lewis spent 12 years building a life large enough that it couldn't disappoint her. She'd grown up watching her parents work themselves down to the bone for something that kept almost being enough, and she'd decided she'd work herself to the very top, where the ceiling was high enough that failure couldn't reach her. What she built was real. What it cost her was also real. The fraud and the betrayal and the alley and the rain were the mechanism, but the thing they broke open was already waiting to be broken. The long, habitual loneliness of a person who had confused success with safety. 2 people who were both hiding, one in smallness, one in magnitude. Both certain their version of hiding was actually living. What changed them wasn't the drama of it. The alley, the lawyers, the AG's investigation, Daniel Crane's eventual accounting. Those things were the occasion. The change was smaller and harder to point to. It was Sophie's unsentimental welcome of a strange woman into her home. It was Zoe on the back step with a sketchbook she hadn't asked for. It was Seth telling the truth about Afghanistan to someone who received it without fixing it. It was 2 people saying me too about the same specific kind of exhaustion and understanding immediately what the other one meant. You can build a version of your life from fear. From the fear of failure, from the fear of loss, from the fear of needing too much or wanting too much, or hoping for something that might not come. And that version of a life will hold. It's structurally sound. It just doesn't have any windows. The window is always the thing you're most afraid to open. Seth Newman opened his when he walked into an alley on a Thursday night in the rain, not because he was brave, but because he couldn't not. Some part of him had been waiting for the moment when the life he'd reduced to its essentials would reveal that it still had more in it than he'd allowed. Zoe Lewis opened hers when she told the truth to a stranger in a small kitchen at midnight, about the money and the betrayal and the partner she'd trusted and the person she'd stopped being somewhere inside the building of everything. She'd expected nothing from it, or had expected to need nothing from it, which is not the same thing. What she received was the first honest conversation she'd had in years. Neither of them would tell you the story that way. Seth would say he just did what made sense given the situation. Zoe would say she was lucky that the situation landed where it did. Sophie would say the horse drawing was actually very good, and both of them were wrong about it. But this is what happened, underneath the things that happened. 2 people who had been solving the wrong problems for years accidentally found each other in the middle of someone else's crisis. And the solving they did together was the right kind. And when it was over, they were both different in ways that couldn't be walked back to the earlier version. That's not a happy ending. Happy ending is too small a phrase for it, too tidy, too resolved. What it is instead is an opening, the sense of a life that has more room in it than it did before, more air, more of the ordinary extraordinary of a Tuesday morning with bad lobby coffee and a door that finally works and a 9-year-old who has opinions about everything and is usually right. The greatest battles in a person's life are rarely the ones that make noise. They're the ones fought in kitchens and stairwells and small apartments, against the version of yourself that has decided to stop wanting, against the habit of making yourself smaller so the world can't reach the things that matter, against the specific loneliness of a person who has decided that needing people is a vulnerability rather than a prerequisite for being alive. Seth Newman won that battle the night he didn't walk past the alley. He'd been walking past things for 5 years. That night, for whatever reason, instinct, exhaustion, something in the sound of it, he didn't. Zoe Lewis won it the night she sat on a pull-out couch in a stranger's apartment and told the truth to someone who wasn't going to use it against her. She hadn't known that was possible. She'd spent 12 years in rooms where the truth was always negotiable. And Sophie Newman, who was 9 years old and had opinions about horses and fish and furniture arrangement and had never once in her life believed that her father's quiet, careful smallness was all he had in him. Sophie won nothing because she'd never been losing. She'd just been waiting, with the particular patience of someone who understands that the people you love sometimes need more time than you do to figure out what they've already got. They were not a perfect family. They were not a family in any official or documented sense. They were 3 people in a stuck, now fixed, apartment in Capitol Hill, Seattle, with a cabin by a lake they intended to visit more, and a couch that faced the window because Sophie was right about the window, and coffee that went cold on the counter because that was just how the mornings went, and a perch and a photograph on the refrigerator beside the colored pencil drawings. And enough, finally, for all of them, enough. Sometimes the greatest victories are not won on battlefields or in boardrooms. Sometimes they're won on a stairwell on a Saturday morning when the door finally opens the way it was always supposed to, and you realize you've been ready to walk through it for longer than you knew.